The letter arrived on a Tuesday, and by Thursday, Annie Mallister's entire life had been sold. Not for land, not for money, but for her sister's vanity and her father's pride. Now rattling westward in a suffocating stagecoach toward a man who expected beauty and got honesty. Instead, Annie clutched a single truth to her chest. She was nobody's first choice. Not her family's, not this rancher's, not even her own. But what she didn't know as the Nebraska plains bled into Wyoming territory was that sometimes God's greatest gifts come wrapped in rejection, and the wrong sister on the right road can still find her way home. Stay with me until the very end of this journey and drop a comment below with your city so I can see how far Annie's story has traveled across this wide world. Now let me take you back to where it all began, to a cold spring morning when everything changed. The morning Annie Mallister's life shattered started like any other, with her hands buried in dough and her mother's cough rattling through the thin walls of their Nebraska farmhouse. March had come in bitter that year, 1876, with frost still clinging to the window glass well past dawn, and the fields outside stretching brown and stubborn under a pale, unforgiving sky. Annie worked the bread with practiced efficiency, her fingers strong from years of labor, her shoulders set in that particular way of women who've learned not to expect softness from the world. She was 23 years old, and looked it not old but not young anymore either. Not in the way that mattered out here, where girls married at 16 and were mothers by 18. Her face was honest rather than pretty, with clear gray eyes, a straight nose dusted with freckles she'd long since stopped trying to hide, and a mouth that smiled less than it used to. Her dark blonde hair, more brown than gold, was pulled back in a simple braid that hung to her waist. Her hands were calloused, her dress was mended, and she had stopped dreaming of anything beyond survival sometime around her 20th birthday. "Annie," her father's voice cracked through the morning quiet like a whip. "Get in here, now." She wiped her hands on her apron, glanced at her mother who wouldn't meet her eyes, and walked into the front room where her father stood. Like judgment itself, a letter clutched in his weathered fist. Thomas Mallister had been a different man once before the war, before the drought, before the bank had started circling like a vulture over their 160 acres. Now he was all angles and anger, his face carved into permanent disappointment, his pride, the only thing he had left that the Kansas Pacific Railroad and the lean years hadn't taken from him. "Yes, Papa." He thrust the letter at her. "Read it." Annie took it carefully, noting the expensive paper, the strong masculine handwriting, the Wyoming postmark. Her eyes scanned the words, once then again, as the meaning slowly settled into her chest like a stone dropping into dark water. "Mr. Mallister, I write to confirm receipt of your last correspondence and your assurance that your daughter, Miss Evelyn Mallister, will arrive in Cheyenne by the 24th of March. As agreed, I have arranged payment of $200 to cover your family's immediate expenses, with the understanding that Miss Evelyn comes as my intended bride. I am a man of my word and expect the same in return. The ranch is prepared for her arrival. I trust she will find Wyoming to her liking, though I'll be plain, this is hard country, and I need a woman who can stand it. Your letters spoke highly of your daughter's character and capability. I'm trusting that trust. I'll meet the Thursday stage. Jesse Hartland." Annie's hands began to tremble. She looked up at her father, then past him to where Evelyn stood in the doorway to the bedroom they shared, still in her nightgown, her beautiful face defiant. Evelyn was everything Annie wasn't, golden-haired and green-eyed, with the kind of delicate features that made men stupid and the kind of curves that made them generous. She was 20 years old and had been the prettiest girl in 3 counties since she was 15. She knew it, and she'd learned to use it the way other women used a paring knife, with precision and without mercy. "Evelyn?" Annie's voice came out smaller than she intended. "What's this about?" "It's about your sister." Their father said, his voice tight with barely controlled rage, refusing to honor this family's commitments. "I never agreed to anything." Evelyn's voice was sharp, petulant. "You arranged this, Papa. You and that rancher talking about me like I'm livestock to be traded. You took his money." Thomas roared, his face flushing dark. "You took $200 of that man's money, bought yourself those fancy dresses and that cameo brooch, and now you want to play the injured innocent. I never asked him to send money. That was your doing. The money came because I gave my word that you'd marry him, because I told him we had a daughter of marriageable age, good character, capable and willing, because this family is 6 months from losing everything, and that money bought us time." The room went very quiet. Even Evelyn's defiance faltered. Annie felt the world tilting. "Papa, you told him Evelyn would marry him without asking her." "I'm the head of this family," Thomas said, his jaw set. "And when a good man, a rancher with land and prospects, writes asking for a wife when he's willing to help a family in need, I don't ask permission. I make the arrangements that keep us alive." "But I won't do it," Evelyn said, lifting her chin. "I won't go to some God-forsaken territory to marry a man I've never met. I won't live in some crude cabin scrubbing floors and bearing children until I'm old at 30. I deserve better than that." "You deserve what you've earned," Thomas said coldly. "Which is nothing." "Thomas," Annie's mother Sarah spoke from her chair by the fire, her voice weak but firm. "This isn't right. You can't force her." "Can't I? I gave my word. More than that, I took his money. If Evelyn doesn't get on that stage Thursday, we're not just dishonorable, we're thieves, and I won't have that shame." "Then send the money back," Evelyn snapped. "There is no money to send back." The words exploded from Thomas like a confession. "It's gone. It went to the bank, to the feed store, to keeping food on this table and a roof over your ungrateful head." The silence that followed was suffocating. Annie felt it before anyone said. It felt the weight of her father's desperation, her sister's selfishness, and her own inevitable sacrifice converging like 3 rivers into one drowning pool. "I'll go." The words were out before she fully understood she'd spoken them. Everyone turned to stare at her. "What?" Thomas's eyes narrowed. Annie swallowed hard, her heart hammering. "I'll go. I'll take Evelyn's place. I'll marry him." "Annie, no," her mother began. "You..." Evelyn's laugh was cruel. "Annie, he's expecting me. He's seen my photograph. He knows what he paid for." The words landed like a slap, but Annie had long since learned not to flinch at her sister's cruelty. "He's expecting someone who'll honor her word," Annie said quietly. "Someone who can work a ranch and won't complain about hard country. That's not you, Evelyn. It never was." Thomas was studying her now, and Annie saw the calculation in his eyes, saw him weighing her worth against his honor and finding her just barely adequate. "The man's expecting a bride," he said slowly. "Expecting the woman from the photograph we sent." "Then we tell him the truth," Annie said, though her voice shook. "We tell him Evelyn can't come, but her sister is willing. We give him the choice." "And if he refuses you?" Evelyn asked sweetly. "If he takes one look at plain Annie Mallister and sends her right back home, then I come home," Annie said, meeting her sister's eyes. "And you can go west and fulfill Papa's promise yourself. Fair?" Evelyn's face went white. She looked at their father, expecting him to refuse to protect her. But Thomas Mallister was looking at Annie with something like relief. "You do this?" he asked. "Leave everything, go west, marry a stranger? To save this family?" "Yes." Annie lifted her chin. "I would." What she didn't say, what she barely admitted to herself, was that there was nothing here to leave. No prospects, no suitors, no future, except watching her sister marry well while Annie grew old taking care of their parents until she became the spinster aunt, useful and unloved. At least in Wyoming, she might be wanted, even if only for her labor. "It's settled then." Thomas's voice was firm, brooking no argument. "Annie goes Thursday." "Thomas, please." Sarah tried again, but a coughing fit seized her, and by the time it passed, the decision had hardened into inevitability. Evelyn fled to the bedroom, slamming the door. Annie stood very still, trying to absorb what she'd just agreed to. Her father turned away without another word, leaving Annie alone with her mother and the slowly rising sun that seemed suddenly both too bright and not bright enough. "Annie," her mother whispered, reaching for her hand, "you don't have to do this." But they both knew that was a lie. The next 3 days passed in a blur of preparation and silence. Thomas gave Annie $20 for the journey in case of emergencies, and a lecture about duty honor and not shaming the family by changing her mind. Her mother, when Thomas wasn't watching, slipped her a small leather pouch containing her own mother's wedding ring. $2 silver and a folded paper with a recipe for fever tea written in shaking script. "For when you need to remember home," Sarah whispered, pressing it into Annie's palm. And Annie,
This story was
he
posted
might
on
be
the
a good
channel
man.
west of
A
Betrayal.
hard man, maybe.
Please
but
do
there
not
are worse
repost
things
it
than
in any
hard.
form.
Evelyn barely spoke to her. On Wednesday night, their last night together, Annie lay awake in the bed they'd shared their entire lives, listening to her sister breathe on the other side of the thin curtain Annie had hung years ago to give them each some privacy. "Evelyn?" Annie whispered into the darkness. "Are you awake?" Silence. "Then what do you want, Annie Gratitude?" "No, I just wanted to say goodbye. You're taking the life that should have been mine." Annie felt something crack inside her chest. "I'm taking the burden you refused. That's not the same thing. He was mine first. The letters, the attention, the promise, he chose me. He chose a photograph and some lies Papa told him. He doesn't know either of us. When he sees you instead of me, he'll know he's been cheated." Annie closed her eyes against the sting of tears. "Maybe. Or maybe he'll be grateful for an honest woman who'll actually show up." Evelyn rolled over and Annie heard the rustle of fabric, the little hitch in her sister's breath that meant she was crying. "I'm not sorry," Evelyn said. "I won't apologize for wanting more than this." "I know," Annie whispered. "I know you're not." They didn't speak again that night. Thursday morning came cold and bright with a wind that promised rain by afternoon. Annie dressed in her best dress, which meant her least mended one, a simple brown wool that matched her practical leather boots, and brought out the gray in her eyes without trying to make them something they weren't. She braided her hair carefully, pinned it in a crown around her head, the way her mother used to wear hers, and packed her single carpet bag with 3 changes of clothes, a nightgown, her Bible, the small leather pouch from her mother, and the photograph of the 4 of them taken before the war. Back when her father smiled and her mother stood straight, and Evelyn didn't know yet that beauty was currency. The stagecoach stop was a 4-mile walk, but Thomas hitched the wagon and drove her in silence, her mother beside him coughing into her handkerchief, Evelyn conspicuously absent. Other passengers were already waiting, a salesman with tired eyes, an older woman in black. 2 cowboys heading west for work. They eyed Annie with vague curiosity, then lost interest. She was too plain to be running away for romance, too young to be a widow, too old to be a hopeful bride. If they only knew. "This is the right thing," Thomas said gruffly as the stage pulled up, the driver calling out the departure. "You're doing your duty to this family." Annie looked at her father, really looked at him, and saw a man who'd traded his daughter for a handful of dollars and called it honor. She felt something in her chest harden and go quiet. "Yes, Papa," she said simply. She kissed her mother's cheek, tasted salt and sickness, and turned away before she could change her mind. The driver helped her up. The door closed. The stage lurched forward. And Annie Mallister left the only life she'd ever known without once looking back, because if she did, she knew she might not have the courage to keep going forward. The journey west was exactly as miserable as Annie had imagined, and worse than she'd prepared for. The stagecoach was cramped, smelling of unwashed bodies' leather and the peculiar dust that seemed to seep through every crack in the wood. The older woman, Mrs. Henley, a widow, heading to Denver to live with her son, was kind enough offering Annie peppermints and cautious conversation. The salesman snored. The cowboys drank whiskey from a flask and told increasingly crude jokes, until Mrs. Henley's sharp glare silenced them. They stopped every 12 to 15 miles to change horses, the stations progressively more crude as they pushed further west. At night they slept in way station bunks that smelled of mildew and mouse droppings, Annie lying awake, listening to the wild emptiness of the prairie outside and wondering what she'd agreed to. On the second day, somewhere in the empty middle of Kansas, Mrs. Henley asked the question Annie had been dreading. "You heading to family in Wyoming, dear?" Annie hesitated, then decided there was no point in lying. "I'm going to marry a rancher in Cheyenne, a man named Jesse Hartland." Mrs. Henley's eyebrows rose. "Mail-order bride, then?" "Something like that." "Well," the older woman patted Annie's hand, "I hope he's a good man, dear. There are good men out west, men who'll treat a wife with respect and fairness. But there are hard men, too, and cruel ones. You won't know which you've got until you're already wed." "I know," Annie said quietly. What she didn't say was that she'd already lived with hard men, that her father's cold disappointment had taught her how to endure, and that she was less afraid of a harsh husband than she was of arriving in Wyoming and being sent straight back home as insufficient. On the third day, they crossed into Colorado, and the landscape began to change. The flatness gave way to rolling hills, then distant mountains, purple and white against an impossibly blue sky. The air tasted different here, thinner, sharper, like it had come from somewhere ancient and cared nothing for human comfort. Annie pressed her face to the window and felt something shift inside her. This was hard country, unforgiving country. But it was also beautiful in a way Nebraska had never been. Beautiful and vast and indifferent enough that maybe a woman could disappear into it and become something new. On the fourth day, they entered Wyoming territory. The land here was wilder, still great stretches of sagebrush and golden grass rock formations that looked like the bones of sleeping giants, and a sky so enormous it made Annie feel simultaneously insignificant and strangely free. They passed cattle ranches, their boundaries marked by wooden fences and distant herds. They passed tiny settlements clinging to the railroad line like barnacles to a ship. They passed through towns with names like Laramie and Pine Bluffs. Each one a collection of rough buildings and rougher men, the smell of horses and cattle and wood smoke hanging in the air like a permanent condition. And on the afternoon of the fifth day, as the sun was beginning its slow descent toward the western mountains, the driver called out, "Cheyenne, 20 minutes!" Annie's heart seized. She smoothed her dress with shaking hands, touched her hair, and tried to remember how to breathe. Mrs. Henley squeezed her hand. "Courage, dear. You've come this far." Yes, Annie thought, and there's no going back now. Mnasab. Cheyenne was bigger than Annie expected, a proper town with a main street of two-story buildings, a train depot, hotels, saloons, and what looked like 1,000 people all moving at once. The noise was overwhelming. After days of prairie silence, the shouts of vendors, the clatter of wagons, the distant whistle of the railroad, the general chaos of civilization trying to impose itself on wilderness. The stage pulled up to the depot in a cloud of dust. The driver climbed down, began unloading luggage. Passengers spilled out stretching and complaining. Annie emerged last, her carpet bag clutched in both hands, her legs unsteady after days of sitting. The late afternoon sun hit her full in the face, making her squint. The platform was crowded with people, families reuniting men, conducting business women in fine dresses that made Annie's worn brown wool look even shabbier by comparison. She stood very still, searching the crowd for a man she'd never met, but whose life she was about to enter anyway. And then she saw him. He stood apart from the crowd near the edge of the platform, and there was something about his stillness that drew the eye. He was tall, over 6 feet, with broad shoulders and a lean, rangy build that spoke of hard physical labor. He wore dark trousers, a tan shirt, a leather vest, and a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed his face. His boots were worn but well made. His hands hanging loose at his sides were scarred and capable. As Annie watched, he pushed his hat back slightly, and she got her first clear look at Jesse Hartland's face. He wasn't handsome in the way men in storybooks were handsome. His face was too weathered, too marked by sun and wind, and something harder. Maybe grief, maybe war, maybe just the accumulated weight of surviving. He had a strong jaw, high cheekbones, a straight nose that looked like it had been broken once, and a mouth set in a line that suggested he didn't smile often or easily. But it was his eyes that made Annie's breath catch, pale gray, almost silver sharp and distant as winter sky. He was scanning the crowd clearly, looking for someone, looking for Evelyn. Annie forced her legs to move. She walked toward him on shaking legs, her carpet bag swinging against her knee, her heart hammering so hard she thought he might hear it. When she was 10 feet away, he noticed her. His eyes flicked over her, once dismissive, just another plain woman in a plain dress, and returned to his search of the crowd. "Mr. Hartland." Annie's voice came out smaller than she intended. He looked at her again, really looked this time, and she saw the confusion in his face, followed by a slow dawning apprehension. Annie swallowed hard. "I'm Annie Mallister. I need to speak with you, please." For a long moment, Jesse Hartland said nothing. His gray eyes traveled over her face, her dress, the carpetbag in her hands, and Annie saw him putting it together, saw the exact moment when he understood. "Where's Evelyn?"
This story was
His
posted
voice
on the
was deep,
channel west
rough-edged,
of
with
Betrayal.
an accent that
Please do not
suggested he'd
repost
come
it
from
in
somewhere
any
south
form.
originally. "She's not coming," Annie said, and forced herself to meet his eyes. I'm here instead. I know this isn't what you expected, and I know you have every right to refuse me. But I'd be grateful if you'd hear me out before you decide." The platform seemed to have gone very quiet, or maybe that was just the blood rushing in Annie's ears. Jesse stared at her for what felt like an eternity, his face unreadable. Finally, he said, "We should talk somewhere private, this way." He turned and walked toward the edge of the platform without checking to see if she followed. Annie grabbed her bag and hurried after him, her stomach churning with fear and relief and something else she couldn't name. He led her to a quieter corner of the depot, near the freight loading area, where the noise of the crowd faded to background murmur. Then he turned to face her, his arms crossed, his expression guarded. "Explain," he said simply. So Annie did. She told him everything: her father's arrangement, Evelyn's refusal, the money already spent, her own decision to come in her sister's place. She didn't make excuses or try to paint it prettier than it was. She just gave him the truth plain and unvarnished, the way she suspected Jesse Hartland preferred things. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. "Your father," he said finally, "wrote me letters describing his daughter. Beautiful," he said, "accomplished, good-natured. He sent a photograph." Annie flinched. "That was Evelyn. I paid $200 based on those representations." "I know, and I know I'm not what you paid for. I'm not beautiful or accomplished. I can't sing or play piano or do needlework worth a damn. But I can work Mr. Hartland. I can cook and clean and manage a household. I don't complain and I keep my word. If you'll have me, I'll be an honest wife who won't shame you or cause trouble. And if you won't," she took a deep breath, "then I'll find work in town and earn enough to get back home, and you can write to my father about being released from the arrangement." Jesse studied her for so long that Annie wanted to squirm, but she held still, held his gaze, and let him see exactly what he was getting, nothing more, nothing less. "You traveled 5 days alone to marry a stranger," he said finally. "Why?" "Because my family needed me to. Because I gave my word. And because—" She hesitated, then decided there was no point in holding back now. "Because there was nothing for me back there. No future, no prospects. At least here I might be useful." Something flickered in those gray eyes, surprise maybe, or recognition. "Useful," he repeated. "Yes, sir." He shook his head slightly. "Don't call me sir. Jesse's fine." He sighed, rubbed his face, and when he lowered his hand, he looked tired. "Miss Mallister, Annie, I'm not sure what to do here. I wasn't prepared for this." "I understand. Do you—" He pinned her with those winter sky eyes. "I'm 42 years old. I've got a ranch 20 miles from here, 600 acres with cattle and horses, and enough work for 10 men, but only money for 2 hands. The house is sound but plain. The life is hard. I wasn't looking for romance or convenience. I was looking for a partner who could stand the work and the isolation without breaking. That's what I'm offering," Annie said quietly. "Nothing more, nothing less." Jesse was quiet again, thinking. Then, "Come with me." He led her through town to a small restaurant, plain but clean, and ordered them both coffee and beef stew without asking what she wanted. They sat across from each other at a corner table, and Annie realized she hadn't eaten since breakfast, that she was exhausted and terrified and desperately hoping this hard-faced stranger would give her a chance. "Tell me about yourself," Jesse said. His hands wrapped around his coffee cup. "Not what your father said or what you think I want to hear. The truth." So Annie did. She told him about growing up on a failing farm, about learning to work when most girls were still playing with dolls, about watching her mother sicken and her father harden, and her sister learn to use beauty as both weapon and shield. She told him about the small dreams she'd had and surrendered about teaching herself to read better by sneaking her brother's school books before he died of scarlet fever at 12, about learning to stretch one chicken into 3 meals and make bread rise with nothing but hope and prayer. She didn't cry or complain. She just told him who she was, a woman who'd learned to endure to work to survive. Not special, not remarkable. Just steady. When she finished, Jesse nodded slowly. I was at Shiloh, he said abruptly. 1862. Second day. Came home different. He paused. Tried farming in Tennessee after, but the land was ruined, and I couldn't stand being around people who knew what I'd been. Came west in 67, worked cattle drives, saved enough to buy land here in 70. Been building ever since. He met her eyes. I don't talk much, and I don't need a woman who does. I don't need fancy cooking or a pretty parlor. I need someone who can doctor a sick calf at midnight and help with branding and not lose her mind when she doesn't see another woman for weeks at a time. I can do that, Annie said. Can you? Or are you just saying what you think I want to hear? I guess you won't know until you give me a chance to prove it. The ghost of something not quite a smile but close flickered across Jesse's face. Fair enough? He finished his coffee, set down the cup. Here's what I'm offering. Come out to the ranch. Stay as my guest for 2 weeks. Work alongside me and my hands see what the life is really like. At the end of 2 weeks, if you still want to stay, we'll marry proper with a preacher. If you don't, or if I decide it won't work, I'll pay your passage back to Nebraska. No shame, no debt. Annie's heart leaped. That's more than fair. It's practical, Jesse corrected. I don't want a wife who'll run off after 3 months because she can't stand the loneliness. And I imagine you don't want to marry a man you'll come to hate. No, Sir Jesse, I don't. He stood, dropped coins on the table for their meal. My wagon's at the livery. We'll head out now, get to the ranch before full dark. He paused, looking down at her. Annie Mallister. I'm not promising you a happy ending. I'm promising you honest work, a roof, and fair treatment. That enough? Annie stood too, picked up her carpet bag, and met his eyes. That's more than I had before. So yes, Jesse Hartland, it's enough. As they walked out into the Wyoming afternoon, the sun already beginning its slide toward the mountains, Annie felt the weight of her old life falling away like a shed skin. Whatever happened next, whether Jesse chose to keep her or send her home, she had done the hardest thing already. She had chosen herself. She had walked away from the people who saw her as expendable and toward a man who at least promised her honesty. And somehow in the vast emptiness of Wyoming territory, that felt like enough. The wagon waited. Jesse helped her up without ceremony, climbed up beside her, and clicked to the horses. They rolled out of Cheyenne toward the setting sun, and Annie watched the town disappear behind them, her heart beating a rhythm that sounded almost like hope. She didn't know it yet, but she'd just taken the first step toward becoming someone new, someone chosen, someone seen. But first there would be work, and silence, and a slow, difficult learning of what it meant to stand beside a man who'd learned not to trust easily in a land that broke the weak and tested the strong. The ranch waited. Her new life waited. And Annie Mallister, no longer second choice, but not yet first, rode toward it all, with her chin up and her eyes open. The story was just beginning. The ranch appeared just as the last light was bleeding out of the sky, materializing from the purple dusk like something conjured from Annie's imagination rather than built by human hands. It sat in a wide valley between two rolling hills, protected from the worst winds, but open enough to catch the morning sun. The house itself was larger than Annie expected, a solid 2-story structure of hewn logs and stone with a wide porch wrapping around the front and a stone chimney rising from one end. Nearby stood a sturdy barn, a bunkhouse, several outbuildings, and a corral where horses moved like shadows in the gathering darkness. It's beautiful. Annie breathed the words escaping before she could stop them. Jesse glanced at her, something unreadable crossing his face. It's functional, he said, but there was a hint of pride beneath the gruffness. Built most of it myself with help from the hands. House went up in 71, barn the year after. As they pulled into the yard, 2 men emerged from the bunkhouse, one tall and lanky with sandy hair and an easy smile, the other shorter and broader, with dark hair going gray at the temples. Both stopped short when they saw Annie sitting beside Jesse on the wagon seat. Well, I'll be damned, the tall one said, then immediately looked embarrassed. Pardon my language, ma'am. Jesse set the brake and climbed down, then came around to help Annie descend. His hands on her waist were impersonal but steady, and he set her on the ground with the same care he'd probably use handling a valuable piece of equipment. Annie Mallister. Jesse said, his voice carrying the weight of a man who didn't like explaining himself but would do it once. She'll be staying at the ranch for a time. Annie, this is Caleb Morrison, he indicated the tall one, and Tom Bridger. They work for me. Ma'am.
This
Caleb
story
swept
was
off his hat,
posted on the
revealing
channel
kind
west
blue
of
eyes and a
Betrayal.
sunburned face.
Please do not
He couldn't have
repost
been more
it
than
in any
25.
form.
Welcome to the Heartland Ranch, Tom nodded, more reserved, but not unfriendly. Ma'am? His eyes went to Jesse, full of questions. Her sister was supposed to come, Jesse said flatly. Didn't. Annie came instead. She'll be staying as a guest for 2 weeks, helping around the place, and then we'll see. His tone made it clear the subject was closed. If the men were surprised or disappointed, they hid it well. Caleb's smile never wavered. Tom just nodded again and said, I'll see to the horses, boss. Jesse grabbed Annie's carpet bag from the wagon bed and started toward the house. Come on, I'll show you where you'll sleep. Annie followed him up the porch steps, acutely aware of Caleb's curious gaze and Tom's careful neutrality. The front door opened into a large main room that served as both parlor and dining area, with a stone fireplace at one end and a solid oak table that could seat 8. The furniture was simple but well made. A worn sofa, 2 chairs, a bookshelf half filled with volumes whose spines were cracked from reading. Everything was clean but clearly lacked a woman's touch. No curtains, no decorations, no softness anywhere. Kitchen's through there, Jesse said, pointing to a doorway. Washroom's off the back. I sleep downstairs in the back bedroom. You'll take the upstairs room. It's got a good bed and a window facing east. Sheets are clean. I wasn't expecting company, but Tom's wife Elena comes once a week to help with laundry and heavy cleaning. She made sure the place was decent. He climbed the narrow stairs and Annie followed, taking in the solid construction. The lack of drafts, the sense that this house was built to last by a man who planned to stay. The upstairs was a single large room under the eaves, simply furnished with a bed, a dresser, a washstand, and a small desk near the window. The bed was covered with a quilt in a wedding ring pattern, the colors faded but the stitching still tight. Jessie set her bag on the bed. Elena made that quilt for me when I bought the place, said no house should be without at least one piece of beauty. He said it matter-of-factly, but Annie sensed the memory behind it. There's water in the pitcher, and I'll have Caleb bring up a basin of hot water so you can wash properly. We eat at 6 breakfast and supper. Lunch is usually cold meat and bread taken wherever you're working. Work starts at dawn. Annie looked around the room at the care that had gone into its construction at the window that would let in the morning light, at the quilt some kind woman had made for a lonely man. Thank you, she said quietly. This is more than I expected. It's just a room. But Jesse's voice had softened slightly. Get settled. I'll call you when supper's ready. He left his boots heavy on the stairs, and Annie was alone in her new room in a house full of strangers 20 miles from the nearest town in a territory she'd never seen until 5 days ago. She sat on the edge of the bed and let herself feel the exhaustion, the fear, the strange relief of having made it this far. Then she stood, unpacked her few belongings into the dresser, washed her face and hands in the cool water from the pitcher, and went downstairs to face whatever came next. The kitchen was large and well-equipped, clearly designed by someone who took cooking seriously. Jesse stood at the stove stirring something in a large pot, his movements economical and practiced. He'd removed his hat and vest, and Annie could see the way his shirt stretched across his shoulders, the silver just beginning to thread through his dark hair. "Can I help?" she asked from the doorway. He glanced back. "Can you make biscuits?" "Yes." "Flour's in that bin, lard's in the crock, buttermilk's in the cold box, oven's hot." Annie rolled up her sleeves and got to work, finding comfort in the familiar motions of measuring and mixing. Jesse continued stirring the pot beef stew by the smell, and they worked in companionable silence. It reminded Annie of working alongside her mother in the mornings before her father woke, when the house was quiet, and the work was just work, not weighted with judgment or expectation. "You cook often?" Annie asked, cutting the biscuits and arranging them on a pan. "Every day. Tom's wife brings extra food sometimes, and Caleb can fry bacon without burning it, but mostly it's on me." "I can take that over, if you want." Jesse turned to look at her fully, his gray eyes assessing. "You trying to prove something already?" "No, just offering to do what I'm good at." He nodded slowly. "We'll see how the next 2 weeks go. Don't want you thinking you have to earn your place every minute. That's not the deal. But Annie knew that was exactly what she had to do. 2 weeks to prove she could survive here could be useful, could be worth keeping. She slid the biscuits into the oven and turned to find Jessie still watching her. "What did your letters say?" she asked suddenly. "The ones you wrote to my father." Jessie's jaw tightened. "Why?" "Because I'd like to know what you were expecting, what you told yourself you wanted in a wife." For a moment she thought he wouldn't answer. Then he said, "I told him I needed a partner, not a decoration, someone who could work and wouldn't break under the isolation. I told him I wasn't a gentleman rancher with money to burn. I was a working man who needed a working woman." He paused. "Your father wrote back about Evelyn, said she was beautiful and accomplished, but also practical and eager to come west. Said she knew her own mind and wouldn't complain about hard living." "And you believed him?" "I believed the parts that mattered. The practical part, the willing part. The beauty," he shrugged. "That was extra, not required." Annie felt something ease in her chest. "Then maybe I'm closer to what you actually needed than Evelyn ever was." "Maybe," Jessie turned back to the stove. "Or maybe you're both just different kinds of wrong for this life, and we'll find that out soon enough." It wasn't cruel the way he said it, just honest, and Annie found she preferred that to false reassurance. When the biscuits were done and the stew was ready, Jessie called the men in. They ate at the big table, the four of them passing bowls and keeping conversation minimal. Caleb tried to fill the silence with talk about the cattle they'd moved that day, about a fence that needed mending, about the weather that was supposed to turn cold by week's end. Tom said little, but his eyes were kind when they landed on Annie, and she sensed he was reserving judgment rather than passing it. "These biscuits are excellent, ma'am," Caleb said, reaching for his third. "Better than anything Jessie makes, no offense, boss." "None taken. It's true." Jessie's attention was on his plate, but Annie saw the corner of his mouth twitch slightly. After supper, the men returned to the bunkhouse, and Annie helped Jessie clean up without being asked. They washed and dried in silence, and Annie was intensely aware of his presence beside her, the size of him, the quiet competence, the sense that he was a man who did everything with the same steady deliberation. "You'll want to get to bed soon," Jessie said when the last plate was put away. "We rise at 5, work until dark. Tomorrow, I'll have you help Elena with the garden and the chickens get you familiar with the place. Day after, we'll see how you do with the horses." "I'm not afraid of hard work," Annie said. "I believe you." Jessie dried his hands on a towel, hung it carefully. "But there's hard work, and then there's ranch work. Different animal entirely." He walked her to the stairs, and they stood there awkwardly for a moment. This man and woman, who were something between strangers and almost married, bound by an agreement, neither had fully chosen, but both were willing to try. "Good night, Annie," Jessie said finally. "Good night, Jessie." She climbed the stairs to her room, undressed in the darkness, and lay in the unfamiliar bed listening to the unfamiliar sounds, the wind in the eaves, the distant lowing of cattle, the creak of the house settling. Through the floorboards, she could hear Jessie moving around downstairs, the soft thud of his boots, the closing of a door. Annie closed her eyes and thought about the day, about arriving in Cheyenne, terrified, and leaving it with something like hope about this hard man who'd offered her fairness instead of promises, about the way he'd looked at her, not with disappointment, but with cautious possibility. She'd expected rejection. She'd expected to be measured against Evelyn and found wanting. Instead, Jessie Hartland had looked at plain Annie Mallister and seen someone who might be exactly what he actually needed. That was more than anyone had ever offered her before. Annie fell asleep to the sound of Wyoming wind and woke to a world washed clean by starlight, ready to begin proving she could belong here. Dawn came cold and blue, painting the valley in shades of silver and shadow. Annie woke to the sound of men's voices outside, the jingle of tack, the stamp of horses in the corral. She dressed quickly in her oldest dress, braided her hair, and hurried downstairs to find Jessie already at the stove, coffee boiling and bacon sizzling in a pan. "Morning," he said without turning around. "Coffee's ready." "Let me do that," Annie said, moving to take over the bacon. "You see to whatever else needs doing." Jessie handed her the spatula and stepped back, watching as she took command of the stove with the ease of long practice. "Eggs in the cold box, bread in that tin. Men eat a lot in the morning, fuel for the day." Annie had breakfast on the table by the time Tom and Caleb came in, stamping the cold from their boots. They ate with the silent efficiency of men who'd worked together for years, and Annie found herself studying them, Caleb, with
This
his
story
easy
was
manner
posted
and
on the
ready
channel
laugh.
west of
Tom
Betrayal.
more serious,
Please do not
but with a
repost it
gentleness
in any
around the
form.
eyes that suggested he'd seen hardship and learned compassion from it. Elena will be here around 9, Jesse told Annie as they finished. She'll show you the routine garden work, chicken feeding, preserving. Tom and Caleb and I will be moving cattle to the north pasture, won't be back until supper. He paused, his gray eyes meeting hers. You'll be alone most of the day. That bother you? No, Annie said honestly. I'm used to my own company. Good. Jesse stood, grabbed his hat. If you need anything, fire 3 shots from the rifle by the door. We'll hear it and come running, but don't fire unless it's serious wolves, intruders, that kind of thing. Annie's eyes widened. Wolves? Haven't had trouble in 2 years, but they're out there. Just stay close to the house and you'll be fine. He said it like he was talking about rain, matter of fact and unconcerned. The men filed out, and Annie was left alone in the big house with the breakfast dishes and the strange sensation of being both guest and potential mistress of a place she didn't yet understand. Elena arrived right at 9, a sturdy woman in her 40s with kind brown eyes, black hair streaked with gray, and the weathered hands of someone who'd worked hard her whole life. She took one look at Annie and smiled. So you're the one, she said, her accent carrying the music of Spanish underneath English. Tom told me. Said you came instead of your sister said Jesse's giving you a trial run. She set down the basket she was carrying and pulled Annie into a quick, firm hug. Smart man, that Jesse. Better to see if you fit before making promises neither of you can keep. Annie found herself relaxing slightly. I'm Annie. Elena Bridger. Tom's my husband, been with Jesse since the beginning, back when this place was nothing but a claim and a dream. She looked around the kitchen approvingly. You made breakfast. Yes, ma'am. Good biscuits, Tom said, and you cleaned up after. That's more than Jesse expected, I think. He told me to come teach you the routine, but you might already know more than he thinks. Elena's smile was knowing. Men like Jesse, good men, hard men. They forget that some women already know how to work. They think because you're young and pretty, oh yes, don't look at me like that. You're prettier than you think, they think you must be soft. But I see your hands, Annie Mallister. Those aren't soft hands. Annie looked down at her calloused palms, the short nails, the faint scars from a lifetime of kitchen work. No, ma'am, they're not. Then we'll get along fine. Come on, I'll show you what needs doing. The next hours passed in a blur of activity. Elena showed Annie the garden, still mostly dormant this early in the season, but with early lettuce and radishes already sprouting, peas climbing their trellises in rows marked off for tomatoes and squash and beans. She showed her the chicken coop where 24 hens scratched and pecked and laid eggs in nest boxes that smelled of straw and warmth. She showed her the root cellar dug deep into the hillside and stocked with preserved vegetables, smoked meat sacks of flour and sugar and cornmeal. Jesse, he plans ahead, Elena explained as they worked. He's seen hard times in the war after it, and he doesn't ever want to be caught unprepared again. This cellar could keep 6 people fed through a whole winter if it had to. They weeded the garden, fed the chickens, collected eggs, and mended a broken slat in the coop wall. Elena talked while they worked, telling Annie about the ranch, about Jesse, about what the life was really like. He's a good man, Elena said as they washed vegetables in the kitchen. Quiet, yes. Hard, yes. But fair, and that's worth more than charm out here. When Tom got hurt 2 years ago, horse rolled on him, broke 3 ribs. Jesse paid the doctor himself, gave Tom light work until he healed, and never once complained about the loss of productivity. That's the kind of man he is. He was at Shiloh, Annie said quietly. Elena nodded. Second day. Doesn't talk about it, but Tom was their 2 different regiment. They recognized something in each other when they met, that's what Tom says. Some kind of shared understanding that doesn't need words. She paused in her work, looking at Annie seriously. War changes men, makes some of them mean, makes some of them broken. Jesse, I think it made him careful, made him slow to trust, slow to open up, but once he gives his word, he keeps it. And if he decides you're his Annie, he'll protect you and provide for you and treat you with respect, even if he never says a pretty word in his life. That's all I'm asking for, Annie said. I'm not looking for romance. Maybe not, Elena said with a knowing smile. But sometimes what we're looking for and what we find are two different things, and sometimes that's better. They made lunch together, cold chicken, fresh bread, pickles from the cellar, and ate at the big table, just the two of them. Elena asked Annie about her family, and Annie found herself telling the truth about her father's coldness, her sister's vanity, her mother's illness, the slow suffocation of being the expendable daughter. You're not expendable, Elena said firmly. You're brave. It takes courage to leave everything you know for a chance at something better. Don't let anyone tell you different. After lunch, Elena showed Annie how Jessie liked things organized, where the tools were kept, how the accounts were managed when the supplies needed ordering from town. It was clear that Jessie ran his ranch with military precision, everything in its place, every task with its proper time. He'll expect you to keep up, Elena warned, not to be perfect, but to try. That's what he respects, effort and honesty. If you can't do something, tell him straight. He hates lying more than he hates failure. As the afternoon shadows lengthened, Elena prepared to leave. She pulled Annie aside at the door, her expression serious. One more thing, she said quietly. There are women in town, women with daughters who had their eyes on Jessie. Rich rancher, good land, respectable. They'll hear you're here, and some of them won't be kind. They'll call you opportunistic or desperate or worse. Don't let it touch you. You're here because Jessie chose to give you a chance, and that's more than most of them ever got. Annie felt a chill. I hadn't thought about that. Well, think about it now. Wyoming's better than a lot of places for women. We can own property here, vote in local elections, but that doesn't mean people won't gossip. Just hold your head up and prove them wrong by being exactly who you are. After Elena left, Annie stood on the porch, watching the sun slide toward the mountains, thinking about what the older woman had said. She was so lost in thought that she didn't hear the riders until they were nearly at the house, Jessie, Tom, and Caleb, returning dusty and tired from a day of hard work. Jessie swung down from his horse with the ease of long practice, his eyes finding Annie immediately. How'd it go with Elena? Good. She taught me a lot. She'd tell you I'm impossible to please. Annie saw the faint glimmer of humor in his eyes. She said you were fair. That's what matters. Something shifted in Jessie's expression. Surprise, maybe, or approval. Supper ready? Not yet, but it will be in an hour. Then I'll see to the horses and clean up. He started to turn away, then stopped. Annie, thank you for helping today. I know you don't have to. I want to, Annie said simply. Jessie nodded once, then led his horse toward the barn, and Annie went inside to start supper, feeling something warm unfurling in her chest that she didn't quite have a name for yet. The days began to blur together in a rhythm of work and weariness and gradual settling. Annie rose with the men, cooked breakfast, worked through the day at whatever tasks needed doing, and cooked supper before falling exhausted into bed. Her hands grew even more calloused, her arms stronger, her face tanned despite her bonnet. She learned the ranch's routines, learned which chickens were broody and which were good layers, learned how to carry water from the pump without spilling, learned the names of all the horses in the corral. She learned that Tom was quiet but observant, that Caleb flirted harmlessly with everything female, including the hens, and that Jessie watched her constantly with those gray eyes, assessing, judging, deciding. On the fourth day, Jessie took her out to the barn and handed her a lead rope attached to a gentle bay mare named Juniper. You ride, Ma? He asked. A little. Mostly plow horses, nothing fancy. Juniper's steady. She'll teach you what you need to know. Jessie demonstrated how to saddle and bridle the horse, his movements patient and precise. Out here, you need to be able to ride. If something happens and you need to get to town or fetch help, you can't do it on foot. For the next hour, Jessie worked with Annie in the corral, teaching her to sit properly, to guide the horse with her knees and reins, to trust the animal beneath her. He was a good teacher, clear in his instructions, patient with her mistakes, quick to praise when she got something right. You're a natural, he said, as Annie successfully guided Juniper through a series of turns. Most city women are scared of horses this size. You're not. I've been around animals my whole life, Annie said, patting Juniper's neck. Just never these kinds. Jesse leaned against the fence watching her. You're doing better than I expected, he said finally. Better than most would. Annie brought Juniper to a halt in front of him. Is that surprising?
This story was
Yes
posted
and
on the
no.
channel west of Betrayal.
Jesse's eyes were thoughtful.
Please do not repost it.
Your father
in any
made
form.
Evelyn sound like she was ready for this life. But watching you, I think maybe you're the one who was always ready. She just got the credit. The words hit Annie harder than she expected. She felt her throat tighten, her eyes sting. Thank you, she managed. Jesse's expression softened slightly. Just telling the truth. That's what we agreed on, isn't it, honesty? Yes, Annie said. That's what we agreed. That evening, as they sat on the porch after supper watching the stars emerge, Jesse surprised her by asking about her childhood. Not the hardship, but the good parts. Annie found herself telling him about summer evenings catching fireflies with her brother before he died, about her mother's songs, about the one time her father took them all to a county fair and bought them each a piece of peppermint candy. In return, Jesse told her about growing up in Tennessee, about learning to shoot when he was 8, about swimming in the creek with his brothers all dead. Now one in the war, too, from fever. His voice was carefully neutral, but Annie heard the grief underneath, recognized it because she carried her own. You've lost a lot, she said quietly. Everyone has, Jesse replied. That's life. Doesn't mean it hurts less. He looked at her, then really looked, and Annie saw something in his eyes shift, a wall coming down maybe, or a door opening, just a crack. No, he said finally. It doesn't. They sat in comfortable silence after that, and Annie thought maybe this was what Elena had meant, that sometimes what you found was better than what you'd been looking for. Because Annie hadn't been looking for understanding or companionship. She'd been looking for survival, for usefulness, for a place to belong. But here, sitting beside this quiet man under the Wyoming stars, she was finding something more, something that felt almost like recognition, like finding someone who spoke the same language of loss and endurance and quiet hope. On the 7th day, everything changed. Annie was in the chicken coop collecting eggs when she heard horses approaching. Not Jesse and the men who weren't due back until supper, but someone else. She emerged to find 3 riders dismounting in the yard, a heavy-set man in expensive clothes, a younger man who looked like trouble, and between them, side saddle on a beautiful black mare, a woman who could only be described as stunning. She was in her late 20s with auburn hair piled elegantly beneath a fashionable hat, green eyes sharp with intelligence, and a riding dress that probably cost more than Annie's entire wardrobe. She smiled when she saw Annie, but it was the kind of smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Hello," she said, her voice cultured and slightly condescending. "You must be the new housekeeper. Is Mr. Hartland available?" Annie felt her face flush. "I'm not—" "We'll wait," the woman interrupted, sliding gracefully from her horse. "I'm Margaret Crawford, and this is my father, Samuel Crawford, and my brother, Robert. We own the ranch that borders Jesse's to the east. We've come to discuss a business matter." Before Annie could respond, Jesse and the men came riding hard into the yard, clearly having heard the approach. Jesse's expression when he saw the Crawfords was unreadable, but Annie noticed how his jaw tightened, how his eyes went cold. "Samuel," he said, swinging down from his horse. "Margaret, Robert, what brings you out?" "Business," Samuel Crawford said heartily, as if they were the best of friends. "And neighborliness, of course. We haven't seen you in town lately, Jesse. Wanted to make sure you were well." "I'm well." Jesse's tone was flat. "What business?" Margaret stepped forward, placing her hand lightly on Jesse's arm in a gesture that suggested familiarity. "Must we discuss it out here? Surely we could go inside, have some coffee, talk properly." Jesse's eyes flicked to Annie, who stood frozen near the chicken coop, feeling completely out of place. "Annie," he said, his voice careful, "these are the Crawfords. They own the Broken Crown Ranch. Samuel, Margaret, Robert. This is Annie Mallister. She's staying at the ranch." The way he said it, not explaining, not apologizing, made Annie's heart beat faster. Margaret's smile turned razor sharp. "Staying how progressive of you, Jesse, though I'm sure tongues will wag in town." "Let them," Jesse said shortly. "Now what's this business you need to discuss?" Samuel cleared his throat. It's about your water access, Jesse. We've been thinking. We can talk out here, Jesse interrupted. Annie, would you put coffee on for 5? Annie nodded and fled gratefully to the house, her heart pounding. Through the kitchen window, she could watch them, Samuel talking and gesturing, Margaret standing close to Jesse, Robert, looking bored. And Jesse standing solid and unmoved, his attention on Samuel, but his awareness clearly extending to everyone else. Annie made coffee with shaking hands, her mind spinning. Margaret Crawford was beautiful, educated, wealthy, everything Annie wasn't. And the way she touched Jesse's arm, the familiarity in her voice, suggested a history Annie knew nothing about. She brought the coffee out on a tray, served it with steady hands despite her nerves, and tried not to notice the way Margaret watched her with calculating eyes. "Such a good little housekeeper," Margaret said sweetly. "Where did you find her, Jesse?" "Nebraska." Jesse said, his voice harder now. "And she's not a housekeeper. She's my guest." "Your guest." Margaret repeated, her eyebrows raised. "How interesting. And how long will this guest be staying?" "As long as she wants," Jesse said flatly. He turned to Samuel. "Now about that water access." They talked for another 20 minutes. Samuel trying to negotiate some kind of agreement about creek water. Jesse refusing politely but firmly. Throughout it all, Margaret kept trying to catch Jesse's eye, kept making little comments clearly designed to provoke or unsettle. Finally, the Crawfords mounted up to leave. Margaret paused beside Jesse, her voice low but not low enough that Annie couldn't hear. "You know where I am when you tire of playing house with farm girls," she said. "My offer still stands." Jesse's expression didn't change. "I was never interested in your offer, Margaret. That hasn't changed." Margaret's face flushed with anger, but she controlled it quickly, smiled tightly, and rode away with her father and brother. The moment they were out of sight, Caleb let out a low whistle. "Well, that was uncomfortable." "Back to work," Jesse said shortly, but his eyes found Annie. "You all right?" "Yes," Annie said, though she wasn't sure it was true. "What was that about?" Jesse sighed, removed his hat, ran his hand through his hair. "The Crawfords have been trying to expand their holdings for years. Samuel wants access to the creek that runs through my land. Margaret," he paused. "Margaret decided 2 years ago that she wanted to be Mrs. Hartland. I've told her no in every way I know how, but she doesn't hear what she doesn't want to hear." "She's beautiful," Annie said quietly. "She's ambitious," Jesse corrected, "and cruel. I've seen how she treats people she considers beneath her. I want no part of that." He put his hat back on, looked at Annie directly. "You understand I'm not comparing you to her, or wishing you were something different. That's not what this is." Annie nodded, wanting to believe him, but feeling the weight of inadequacy settling back onto her shoulders, the old familiar weight that said she was second choice, second best, not quite enough. As if reading her thoughts, Jesse stepped closer. "Annie Mallister," he said, his voice low and intense. "Margaret Crawford is everything I don't want in a wife. You're everything I do. Don't let her make you think otherwise." Before Annie could respond, he turned and strode toward the barn, leaving her standing there with her heart pounding and the coffee tray clutched in her trembling hands. That night, Annie couldn't sleep. She lay in the darkness, listening to the house settle around her, thinking about Margaret Crawford's perfect face and perfect dress, about the way she'd touched Jesse's arm with such confidence about the offer that still stood. Around midnight, unable to stand it anymore, Annie rose and went to the window. The valley below was silver with moonlight, and on the porch she could see a figure standing at the rail looking out at the same landscape. Jesse. Without thinking, Annie pulled on her wrapper and went downstairs, her bare feet silent on the wooden floors. She stepped out onto the porch and Jesse turned unsurprised. "Can't sleep either?" he asked. "No." Annie joined him at the rail, wrapping her arms around herself against the chill. "Too much thinking." "Dangerous habit," Jesse said, but there was warmth beneath the words. They stood in silence for a moment, and then Jesse said, "I want to show you something. Wait here." He disappeared into the house and returned a moment later with a bundle of papers. Letters, Annie realized, tied with string. He handed them to her. "These are the letters I wrote to your father," Jesse said quietly. "The ones where I tried to explain what I was looking for, what this life would be like. Read them." Then you'll understand what I was actually asking for, what I actually needed. Annie took the letters with trembling hands. Jesse, read them, he said, and then decide if you still think Margaret Crawford is what I want, because I promise you, Annie, she never was. He left her there on the porch with the moonlight and the letters, and Annie
This story
untied
was
the string
posted
with
on the
shaking
channel
hands
West of
and began
Betrayal.
to read the words
Please do not
Jesse Hartland
repost
had
it
written
in any form.
in the loneliness of winter nights, pouring his heart onto paper in the hope that someone somewhere might understand. And as she read, Annie Mallister finally began to believe that maybe, just maybe, she might be exactly what Jesse Hartland had been looking for all along. The letters were written in a careful masculine hand that suggested each word had been chosen deliberately, weighed and measured before being committed to paper. Annie sat on the porch steps, the moonlight bright enough to read by, and let Jesse Hartland's written voice wash over her like a revelation. The first letter was dated November 1875, 4 months before Annie had ever heard his name. Mr. Mallister, I received your response to my advertisement and appreciate your straightforward approach. Since you've asked for honesty about my circumstances, I'll give it to you plain. I am 41 years old, unmarried, and likely to remain so unless I take deliberate action. I own 600 acres in Wyoming Territory, 20 miles from Cheyenne, with a house I built myself, good water, and cattle that are thriving despite the harsh winters. I fought for the Union at Shiloh and came home changed in ways I won't detail here. I've spent the last 9 years building something that matters, something that will last beyond me. What I need is a partner, not an ornament. I need a woman who can stand the silence of this country without going mad from loneliness, who can work beside me without complaint, who understands that prosperity here is earned inch by inch through sweat and stubbornness. I'm not offering romance or ease. I'm offering respect, provision, and honest dealing. If your daughter is the woman you describe, practical, capable, willing to work, then I believe we could build something worthwhile together. But I'll not have a woman here who will wilt at the first hardship or pine for city life. This country breaks the weak. I need to know she's strong. Please respond with candor. I've no patience for pretense. Jesse Hartland. Annie's throat tightened. This was a man who'd been alone so long he'd forgotten how to ask for anything but partnership. No flowery words, no false promises, just raw honesty and a kind of desperate hope that someone somewhere might be built for the same hard life he'd chosen. She read on through Jesse's subsequent letters where he'd described the ranch in careful detail, where he'd asked questions about Evelyn's experience with animals and cooking and cold winters, where he'd admitted in one vulnerable moment that he was tired of eating alone and sleeping alone and building a future with no one to share it. I don't expect love, he'd written in February. I'm past the age for foolishness, but I hope for companionship, for someone to talk to in the evenings, for someone who'll stand with me when the work is hard and the winters are harder, for someone who'll look at this valley and see what I see, not what it is, but what it could be. Annie pressed her hand to her mouth, tears streaming down her face. These weren't the letters of a man who wanted beauty or refinement. These were the letters of someone who'd been lonely so long he'd learned to live with it, but who still hoped quietly, carefully that loneliness didn't have to be permanent. And her father had sent Evelyn's photograph and descriptions that had nothing to do with the woman Jesse actually needed. The last letter was dated 2 weeks before Annie's arrival, and it was shorter than the others. Mr. Mallister, your last letter assures me that Evelyn will arrive on the Thursday stage, and I'm holding you to that word. I've sent the money as agreed, $200 to help with your family's circumstance, given in good faith that you're dealing honestly with me. I've spent the last 4 months imagining what it might be like to have someone here. I fixed up the upstairs room, had Elena make a quilt, bought supplies I wouldn't normally need. I've let myself hope, which is dangerous for a man like me. Don't disappoint me, Mallister. I've been disappointed enough for one lifetime. Jesse Hartland. Annie folded the letters with shaking hands, tied them carefully with the string, and sat in the moonlight, feeling like she'd been given a window into Jesse's soul. He'd been writing to a fantasy to a woman her father had invented, using Evelyn's face and Annie's actual qualities. No wonder he hadn't been angry when Annie showed up instead. She was closer to what he'd actually asked for than Evelyn had ever been. You finished. Jessie's voice came from the doorway, startling her. Annie wiped her eyes quickly, stood. Yes, Jessie, Don't, he said quietly, stepping out onto the porch. Don't apologize for crying. Those letters, I laid myself bare in them. I know that. You were writing to the wrong sister all along, Annie said, her voice breaking. Everything you asked for, everything you needed, that was me, not Evelyn. And Papa knew it. He just thought Evelyn was more valuable. Jessie moved to stand beside her at the rail, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him in the cold night air. Your father's a fool, he said bluntly, but I'm grateful for his foolishness because it brought you here instead of her. Annie turned to look at him, this hard man who was slowly revealing himself to be anything but. Are you truly, or are you just making the best of a bad situation? Jessie was quiet for a long moment, his gray eyes reflecting the moonlight. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. He wasn't quite hiding. Annie Mallister, I've spent 10 days watching you work yourself to exhaustion, trying to prove you're worth keeping. I've watched you learn every task I set without complaint, laugh at Caleb's terrible jokes, talk gentle to the horses, and make this house feel less empty than it's been in years. I've watched you face Margaret Crawford's cruelty with dignity and read my letters without judging the loneliness in them. He paused, took a breath. So yes, truly, I'm grateful you came instead of her. Annie felt something crack open in her chest, something that had been locked tight for so long she'd forgotten it was there. I'm not beautiful like Evelyn. I'm not accomplished or refined. I'm just... You're real, Jessie interrupted. You're honest. You're strong in ways that matter out here. And when I look at you, I don't see someone playing a role or pretending to be something they're not. I see a woman who knows what hard work is and doesn't flinch from it. That's worth more than beauty, Annie. It's worth everything. The words hung between them in the moonlight, heavy with meaning and promise. Annie wanted to respond, wanted to tell him that she saw him too, saw past the rough exterior to the lonely, hoping man underneath. But before she could find the words, Jessie straightened suddenly, his body going tense. Storm coming, he said, his voice sharp with concern. Big one by the feel of it. Annie followed his gaze to the western horizon where clouds were building with unnatural speed, blotting out the stars one by one. The wind was picking up, carrying the smell of rain and something electric, something dangerous. Get inside, Jessie said, already moving toward the barn. I need to secure the animals, get the men up. This is going to be bad. Within minutes, the ranch exploded into controlled chaos. Tom and Caleb emerged from the bunkhouse at Jessie's shout, and the three men worked with practiced efficiency, moving horses into the barn, securing gates, bringing in anything that could become a projectile in high winds. Annie helped where she could, her heart pounding with a fear she didn't quite understand yet. Spring storms here are vicious, Elena had warned during their first day together. They come out of nowhere, hit like the wrath of God, and leave destruction in their wake. When Jessie tells you to take cover, you do it, no questions. The first drops of rain hit just as the men finished securing the barn. Within seconds, it became a deluge, sheets of water driven nearly horizontal by winds that screamed like something alive and furious. Lightning split the sky, thunder following so close it shook the ground. Everyone inside, Jessie shouted over the roar of the storm. Now! They crowded into the house, 4 people dripping and breathless, and Jessie immediately went to the windows, closing shutters, checking for leaks. The wind battered the house with a fury that made Annie's breath catch. She'd seen storms in Nebraska, but nothing like this. This was primal, violent, the kind of weather that reminded you how small and fragile humans really were. Creek's going to flood, Tom said grimly, peering through a crack in the shutters. It always does with storms like this. Question is how bad? We moved the cattle to high ground yesterday, Jessie said, his voice tight with tension. They should be fine if they stay put, but if they spook... A crash of thunder cut him off so loud it felt like the sky was tearing open. Annie jumped, and without thinking, Jessie's hand found hers, squeezed once solid grounding real. They waited out the worst of the storm, huddled in the main room, listening to the fury outside, and hoping the house Jessie had built with his own hands would hold. Caleb tried to lighten the mood with stories, but his voice was shaky. Tom sat silent and watchful, and Jessie stood at the window, His body coiled tight with the need to be out there, checking, fixing, protecting what was his. Annie watched him and understood suddenly what these 10 days had really been about. Not just proving she could work, but proving she could stand beside a man like this, a man who'd fight storms and wolves in his own loneliness to protect what he'd built. A man who needed a partner strong enough to stand when he couldn't, to hold when he had to let go. After an hour that felt like 10, the worst passed. The wind died to a manageable
This story
howl.
was posted
The
on the
rain
channel
lessened to a
west of
steady
Betrayal.
pour.
Please
Jesse
do not
grabbed his
repost
coat
it
and
in any
hat.
form.
"I'm going to check the herd," he said. "Tom, Caleb, we're coming," Tom said, already moving. "Jesse, wait." Annie started, but he was already at the door. "Stay inside," he said, not unkindly. "Please, Annie, I need to know you're safe here." Then they were gone, 3 men riding out into the aftermath of the storm, and Annie was left alone in the big house, with her fear and the sound of rain on the roof. She tried to stay calm, tried to trust that Jesse knew what he was doing. She made coffee that no one was there to drink, paced the floor, peered uselessly out the windows at the darkness. An hour passed. Then 2. When she heard the gunshots, 3 sharp reports cutting through the rain, Annie's blood went cold. The signal. Someone was in trouble. She didn't think. She grabbed Jesse's rifle from beside the door, the one he'd shown her how to use just in case, pulled on the heavy oilskin coat hanging on the peg, and ran out into the storm. The rain hit her like a fist, instantly soaking through everything. The yard was a sea of mud, the darkness broken only by lightning flashes that painted the world in harsh white and black. Annie could hear the creek now, not the gentle burble she'd grown used to, but a roar like an angry beast. Another gunshot closer this time from the direction of the creek. Annie ran her boots sliding in the mud, her breath coming in gasps. She reached the creek bank and stopped, her heart seizing at what she saw. The creek had transformed into a raging torrent, brown water churning with debris, branches, fence posts, the carcass of what might have been a deer. And in the middle of that fury, Jesse clung to a half-submerged boulder, the water trying to tear him loose. His horse was gone. His hat was gone. And even from here, Annie could see he was weakening, his grip failing. 20 feet downstream, caught in a tangle of brush at the water's edge, a calf bawled in terror, its front legs trapped. "Jesse!" Annie screamed, but the storm swallowed her voice. Tom and Caleb appeared on the opposite bank, Caleb already swinging a rope trying to get a throw to Jesse. But the distance was too great, the wind too fierce. Every throw fell short. Annie looked at the water, at Jesse's white-knuckled grip on the boulder, at the calf struggling for its life. She thought about the letters about the lonely man who'd hoped for a partner strong enough to stand with him. She thought about Elena's words. Sometimes what we find is better than what we're looking for. And she thought about 10 days of slowly falling in love with a hard man in a hard country, and how she was damned if she'd lose him now. Annie waded into the water. The current hit her immediately, trying to sweep her away. She grabbed for a sturdy branch overhanging the bank, used it to steady herself, and pushed forward. The water was chest deep and numbingly cold, full of debris that battered her legs. She could hear Caleb shouting. Jesse yelling something that might have been her name, but she didn't stop. She reached a fallen tree that stretched partway across the swollen creek and climbed onto it, using her hands and knees, the rifle abandoned on the bank. The wood was slick and treacherous, but it got her close enough that when she lay flat and stretched out her arm, her fingers brushed Jesse's. "Grab on!" she screamed over the roar of water. "Get back!" Jesse shouted, his face pale with exhaustion and fury. "Annie, get out of here! Not without you! Give me your hand!" For a moment she thought he'd refuse out of sheer stubborn pride. Then another surge of water hit and his grip slipped, and survival instinct overrode everything else. Jesse lunged for Annie's hand. She caught his wrist with both hands, feeling the jolt as the current tried to tear him away. Pain shot through her shoulders as she held on with everything she had, her legs locked around the log, her muscles screaming. Jesse was dead weight in the water, exhausted beyond endurance, and Annie was terrified she wasn't strong enough. "Pulset," Tom's voice suddenly close. He'd waded in from the other side, was reaching for Jesse's other arm. Together, inch by agonizing inch, they dragged Jesse out of the main current and toward the bank. Caleb was there with a rope, and between the 3 of them, they hauled Jesse onto solid ground. He collapsed, coughing up creek water, shaking with cold and exhaustion. Annie dropped beside him, her own body trembling so hard her teeth chattered. "You damn fool woman!" Jesse gasped when he could speak. "You could have died." "So could you." Annie shot back, her voice fierce. "What were you doing out there? The calf got caught. When the herd spooked, couldn't leave it. And nearly drowned yourself in the process." Annie was crying now, the fear and adrenaline overwhelming her. "You stubborn, impossible man." Jesse grabbed her face in both hands and kissed her. It was cold and desperate and tasted like creek water and fear, and it was the most honest thing Annie had ever felt. When he pulled back, his gray eyes were blazing with something that looked like fury and terror and wonder all mixed together. "Don't ever scare me like that again," he said roughly. "I can lose cattle. I can lose horses. I can't lose you. Do you understand me? I can't lose you." Annie pressed her forehead to his, both of them, shaking both, soaked to the bone and battered by the storm. "Then don't do something stupid like trying to rescue a calf single-handed in a flood. The calf's worth money to—" "You're worth more." The words came out fierce, unguarded. "To me, you're worth more." Jesse's arms came around her, pulling her close despite the cold and the mud and Tom and Caleb watching from a respectful distance. They stayed like that for a long moment, two people who'd almost lost something they'd only just found. "The calf," Jesse said, finally pulling back. "We need to—" "Already got it," Caleb called from downstream, grinning despite being drenched. "Damn thing's fine, just scared. Boss, you all right?" "I'll live." Jesse stood slowly, helped Annie up, and kept her hand in his like he was afraid she'd disappear if he let go. "Let's get back to the house. We need dry clothes and hot coffee before we all catch our deaths." They trudged back through the mud, leading the rescued calf, Jesse leaning on Annie more than he probably wanted to admit. By the time they reached the house, the storm was finally breaking, the rain easing to a drizzle, the first hint of dawn coloring the eastern sky. Inside, Annie bullied all three men into changing clothes while she built up the fire and put coffee on with hands that wouldn't quite stop shaking. When Jesse emerged from his room in dry clothes, his hair still damp, he found Annie standing by the stove staring at nothing, the reality of what had almost happened finally hitting her. "Annie." His voice was gentle. She turned and he was there, solid and real and alive. The sob came up from somewhere deep, and suddenly she was in his arms again, crying against his chest while he held her, and murmured things that might have been comfort or might have been apologies. "I thought you were gone," she whispered. "I thought the water would take you, and I'd lose you before I even—" She couldn't finish. "Before what?" Jesse asked softly, his hand stroking her hair. Annie pulled back enough to look at him, at this man who'd given her honesty and respect, and the first real hope she'd felt in years. "Before I could tell you that these 10 days, Jesse, I know we agreed this was just a trial, that we'd decide at the end of 2 weeks. But I don't need 2 weeks. I already know." Jesse's eyes searched hers, and Annie saw her own fear and hope reflected back. "Know what? That I want to stay. That I want to be your wife, your partner. That I want to build this life with you." She took a shaking breath. "You said in your letters you didn't expect love. But Jesse, I think I'm already halfway there. And if that scares you, if that's not what you wanted." He kissed her again, softer this time, but no less certain. When he pulled back, his eyes were bright with emotion. He wasn't trying to hide anymore. "Annie Mallister," he said, his voice rough. "I started falling for you the moment you stood on that platform in your worn brown dress and told me the truth instead of a pretty lie. Every day since watching you work and laugh and fit into this place like you were always meant to be here." He shook his head. "I didn't think I'd get to have this. Didn't think I deserved it. But here you are, and I'm not fool enough to let you go." "Then don't," Annie whispered. "Choose me. Out of truth, not obligation. Choose me because you want to." Jesse's smile was small, but real, transforming his face. "I already have," he said simply. "The moment you waded into that creek after me, I chose you. Maybe even before that. Maybe I've been choosing you since you first showed up and refused to be anything but exactly who you are." Dawn was breaking outside, painting the world in shades of gold and pink, and through the window Annie could see the valley Jesse had built his life around, scarred by the storm, but still standing still beautiful in its wild, unforgiving way. "We should probably tell Tom and Caleb," Annie said, not moving from Jesse's arms. "Probably." Jessie pressed a kiss to her forehead. "They're drinking coffee on the porch, giving us privacy. Caleb's probably got money riding on how this turns out."
This
Annie
story
laughed,
was posted
a
on the
sound
channel
surprising
West
her.
of Betrayal.
"Who did he
Please
bet
do
on?"
not repost it
"You,"
in any form.
Jessie said with certainty. "Caleb's always been smart that way." They stood there as the light grew stronger. Two people who'd found each other through circumstances neither had chosen, but both were learning to be grateful for. Outside, the storm was passing, leaving behind a world washed clean and full of new possibilities. Annie thought about the letters she'd read about the lonely man who'd written them, hoping for partnership and finding something more. She thought about her sister back in Nebraska, probably already forgetting Annie existed. She thought about her father's disappointment and her mother's quiet tears, and she realized she didn't regret any of it. Every hard moment, every sacrifice, every mile of that uncomfortable journey west, it had all been necessary to bring her here to this man, to this moment of choosing and being chosen. "Jessie," she said quietly. "Yeah. Thank you for giving me a chance when you didn't have to, for seeing me when most people look right through me, for—" He stopped her with a gentle finger on her lips. "Don't thank me for doing what any decent man would do. Thank me for being smart enough to recognize a good thing when it shows up on my doorstep wearing someone else's name." Annie smiled, really smiled, and felt the last of her old life fall away like a discarded coat. She was Annie Hartland now, or would be soon enough. Not second choice, not second best, but first and only chosen deliberately by a man who knew what he wanted and wasn't afraid to claim it. They went out onto the porch together, hand in hand, to face Tom and Caleb's knowing grins and the new day breaking over Wyoming territory. The ranch had survived the storm. So had they. And somehow Annie thought that felt like a promise that whatever came next, whatever hardships this hard land threw at them, they'd face it together. She looked up at Jesse, at his scarred hands and weather-beaten face, and eyes that finally looked less lonely. "So when do we do this properly? When do we make it official?" "Soon as I can get the preacher out here," Jesse said firmly. "I'm not giving you time to change your mind." "I won't," Annie promised. "I know," Jesse said, squeezing her hand. "That's what I'm counting on." As the sun climbed higher, burning off the last of the storm clouds, Annie Mallister stood on the porch of her new home and felt something she'd almost given up hoping for, the bone-deep certainty that she was exactly where she was supposed to be, with exactly who she was supposed to be with. The journey had been long and hard, and nothing like what she'd imagined. But the destination, this man, this land, this life they'd build together, was worth every difficult mile. The preacher came 3 days later, riding up to the ranch on a gray mule with his Bible wrapped in oilcloth, and his expression suggesting he'd heard the gossip and come to form his own judgment. Reverend Samuel Hutchins was a spare man in his 50s with shrewd eyes and a Missouri accent, and he sat at Jesse's table drinking coffee while studying Annie with the careful assessment of someone who'd married too many couples who had no business being wed. "Miss Mallister," he said, finally setting down his cup. "Jesse tells me you arrived here less than 2 weeks ago, having never met him before, that you came in place of your sister who refused the arrangement, and that now you wish to marry him. That about sum it up." Annie met his gaze steadily. "Yes, sir. That's the truth of it. And you're certain this is what you want, not what you're being pressured into?" "I'm certain," Annie said firmly. "More certain than I've been of anything in my life." The Reverend turned to Jesse. "And you sent for a different woman entirely. You're content with this substitution." Jesse's hand found Annie's under the table.
This story was
squeezed
posted
gently.
on the channel West
"I'm
of
content
Betrayal.
with the woman I got.
Please do not
More
repost
than
it
content.
in any form."
I'm grateful." Reverend Hutchins studied them both for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "I've been marrying folks for 23 years. I can usually tell when it's going to take and when it's going to fail. You two—" He paused, smiled slightly. "You've got something real. I can see it in how you look at each other, how you sit. That's rare, especially out here, where so many marriages are just transactions." He stood, pulled his Bible from his coat. "I'll marry you, but I'll do it proper with witnesses and words that mean something. This isn't a contract, it's a covenant. You understand?" "We do," Jessie and Annie said together, and the Reverend's smile widened. They were married in the front room of the ranch house with Tom and Caleb and Elena as witnesses, the afternoon sun streaming through the windows and painting everything gold. Annie wore the best dress she owned, the same brown wool she'd arrived in, but Elena had helped her press it and had woven wildflowers into her hair. Jessie wore his cleanest shirt and had actually shaved, making him look younger and almost vulnerable. Elena cried. Caleb grinned like he'd won a bet, which he probably had. Tom stood solemn and proud, his hand on his wife's shoulder. And Jessie and Annie stood before the Reverend and promised to stand together through whatever this hard country would throw at them. "Do you, Jessie Robert Hartland, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, until death parts you?" "I do." Jessie's voice was steady, his gray eyes never leaving Annie's face. "And do you, Annie Catherine Mallister, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, until death parts you?" Annie thought about the journey that had brought her here, the betrayal, the fear, the long miles and longer nights. She thought about Jesse's letters and his loneliness and the way he'd looked at her on that Cheyenne platform with confusion that had slowly transformed into hope. She thought about the creek and the storm and the moment she'd known she'd rather die than let him go. "I do," she said, her voice clear and certain. Jessie slipped a simple gold band onto her finger, his mother's ring, he told her later. The only thing he'd kept from his old life. Annie had nothing to give him in return, but he kissed her hand and whispered that she'd already given him everything that mattered. When the Reverend pronounced them man and wife, Jessie kissed her gently, almost reverently, like she was something precious he was afraid of breaking. The witnesses cheered and Elena hugged them both fiercely, and Caleb produced a bottle of whiskey he'd been saving for a special occasion. They celebrated with a simple supper that Elena and Annie had prepared that morning: roasted chicken, fresh bread, early vegetables from the garden, and a dried apple pie that made even Jessie's face soften with pleasure. The conversation was easy and warm, full of the comfortable teasing of people who knew each other well and wished each other happiness. As darkness fell and the guests prepared to leave, Elena pulled Annie aside in the kitchen. "You're a wife now," she said softly. "And that means different things to different people. But with Jesse," she paused, choosing her words carefully. "He's a good man, Annie, but he's been alone a long time. He may not know quite how to be a husband. Be patient with him. Be honest. And don't let him retreat into silence when things get hard. Make him talk to you even when he doesn't want to." Annie nodded, her throat tight. "I will. Thank you, Elena, for everything." "You're welcome, mija." Elena kissed her cheek. "Now go to your husband. He's been watching the door for the last 10 minutes, waiting for us all to leave so he can have you to himself." After the guests departed, Annie stood in the kitchen cleaning up the last of the dishes, her new ring catching the lamplight, her heart beating fast with anticipation and nervousness. She was a married woman now, Jesse's wife, and while they'd shared a desperate kiss in the storm and gentle ones since tonight would be different, tonight they'd share more than just promises. She heard Jesse's footsteps, felt him come up behind her. His hand settled on her waist and he pressed a kiss to the nape of her neck that made her shiver. "Leave the dishes," he said quietly. "They'll keep until morning." Annie turned in his arms, looked up at this man who was now her husband. "Jesse, I should tell you I don't know much about what comes next. I've never—" "I know," Jesse said gently. "Neither have I not with someone who matters. We'll figure it out together." He cupped her face in his scarred hands. "Annie, I promise you this, I'll never hurt you. I'll never demand what you're not ready to give. We have time, all the time we need." Annie felt tears prick her eyes. "I'm not afraid. Not of you. Just nervous, I suppose." Jesse smiled that rare, transforming smile that made him look almost boyish. "So am I," he admitted. "Terrified, actually. What if I'm no good at this husband business? What if I disappoint you?" Annie laughed softly, stood on her toes to kiss him. "Then we'll both be disappointments together. That seems fair." He lifted her easily, carried her through the house to the bedroom he'd prepared, his bedroom now, theirs. He'd put fresh sheets on the bed, brought in wildflowers in a jar, lit the lamp low. It was simple and honest like everything else about Jesse Hartland. What passed between them that night was tender and awkward and utterly real. Jesse was patient and gentle.
This story
and Annie
was
was
posted
brave
on
and
the
trusting,
channel
and
West
together
of
they
Betrayal.
learned the language of
Please
each other's
do not
bodies,
repost
the give
it
and
in
take
any
of
form.
intimacy with someone you chose and who chose you back. When they finally lay tangled together in the darkness, Jesse's arms wrapped around her and her head on his chest, Annie felt a completeness she'd never known existed. Annie, Jesse's voice was rough in the darkness. I never thought I'd have this, a wife who fits here, who fits with me. I keep thinking I'm going to wake up and find out it was all a dream. Annie pressed a kiss to his chest right over his heart. Not a dream. Real. I'm real, and I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere. Jesse's arms tightened around her. Good, he whispered, because I'm keeping you. They fell asleep like that two people who'd found each other against all odds, and for the first time in years, neither of them was lonely. The next weeks passed in a rhythm that felt almost like happiness. Annie settled into her role as Jesse's wife, with the same steady competence she'd brought to every other task in her life. She managed the household, tended the garden, helped with the animals, and learned the 1,000 small details of running a working ranch. Jesse taught her to ride properly, to shoot accurately, to read the weather and the land. They worked side by side during the day and fell into each other's arms at night, building a partnership that was equal parts practical and passionate. But happiness in Wyoming territory was never uncomplicated, and trouble came calling on a bright morning in late April. Annie was in the garden pulling weeds when she heard horses approaching. She looked up to see 3 riders, Margaret Crawford on her black mare, flanked by 2 men Annie didn't recognize. Margaret was dressed in an expensive riding habit, her auburn hair perfectly arranged, her expression cold and calculating. "Good morning," Margaret called, her voice sweet as poisoned honey. "Is Mr. Hartland available? I need to speak with him about a business matter." Annie stood slowly, wiping her hands on her apron. "He's out moving cattle. Won't be back until evening." "How convenient." Margaret dismounted with practiced grace, handing her reins to one of the men. "Then perhaps I'll wait. We can have a little chat, you and I." Every instinct Annie had screamed danger, but she forced herself to stay calm. "Would you like coffee? I was about to take a break anyway." "How domesticated you've become," Margaret said, following Annie toward the house. "Playing ranch wife must be quite the adventure for a girl from, where was it, Nebraska?" "Yes, ma'am, Nebraska." Annie led Margaret into the kitchen, put the coffee on, and tried not to show how much the other woman's presence unsettled her. Margaret settled herself at the table like she owned the place, her sharp eyes taking in every detail. "Jesse's made some improvements since the last time I was here. New curtains, I see, flowers on the table, a woman's touch." Her smile didn't reach her eyes. "Tell me, Annie, may I call you Annie, what exactly did you promise him to get him to marry you so quickly?" Annie felt her face flush but kept her voice level. "I promised him honesty and hard work, same thing he promised me." "How quaint. And he married you, 2 weeks after you arrived? Faster than he'd buy a horse, I imagine. That must tell you something about how desperate he was." Margaret accepted the coffee Annie poured, sipped it delicately. "You do realize you're a rebound, don't you? A consolation prize when the real bride refused to come." "I know exactly what I am," Annie said quietly, sitting across from Margaret. "I'm Jesse's wife chosen deliberately. That's enough." "Is it—" Margaret leaned forward, her voice dropping to something that would have sounded sympathetic.
This story
if
was
Annie hadn't
posted
seen
on the
malice
channel
in her
West
eyes.
of Betrayal.
Because
Please
I know
do not
things about
repost
Jesse
it
Hartland
in any
that
form.
you don't. I know about his nightmares from the war. I know about the darkness that lives in him. I know he proposed to me once 2 years ago, and I turned him down because I wasn't ready to bury myself on a cattle ranch. But I've reconsidered." She paused. "And I always get what I reconsider, Annie. Always." Annie felt something cold settle in her stomach. "He proposed to you?" "Oh, yes. Very romantic, actually. Down on one knee in the moonlight after a town dance. He was quite heartbroken when I refused. Didn't you ever wonder why he was so willing to marry a mail-order bride? Why a man like him, successful, handsome, in a rough way respected, would need to send away for a wife?" Margaret's smile was cruel. It's because no woman here would have him. Not after I rejected him. It damaged his pride, you see. Made him look desperate and foolish. Annie wanted to believe it was all lies, but there was enough truth mixed in to make her doubt. Jesse had been alone. He had seemed desperate in those letters, and he'd never mentioned Margaret beyond saying she'd set her sights on him. If you rejected him, why are you here now? Annie managed to ask. Because I made a mistake, Margaret said simply. I thought I could do better, but it turns out Jesse Hartland is the best prospect in 3 counties. And now that he's married well, he's even more appealing. There's something about taking what belongs to someone else that's particularly satisfying. She smoothed her skirt. I'm not telling you this to be cruel, Annie. I'm telling you this as a warning. When Jesse comes to his senses, and he will once the novelty of playing house with you wears off, I'll be waiting. And you'll be sent back to whatever hovel you came from, a failed wife with a reputation in ruins. She moved toward the door, then paused. Oh, and one more thing. That property dispute my father mentioned, Jesse needs our water access to survive the summer when the creek runs low. We're willing to negotiate, but only if Jesse is amenable to certain arrangements. I'm sure you understand. Margaret left in a swirl of expensive perfume and veiled threats, and Annie stood in her kitchen feeling like the ground had shifted beneath her feet. She told herself Margaret was lying, trying to cause trouble, but the doubts had been planted and they grew like weeds in the hours before Jesse came home. She was still sitting at the table, her coffee long cold, when Jesse walked in at dusk, dusty and tired. He took one look at her face and went still. What happened? Margaret Crawford was here. Annie said, her voice carefully neutral. She said she needed to discuss business with you. Jesse's jaw tightened. What did she say to you? That you proposed to her 2 years ago, that she rejected you, that you only sent for a mail-order bride because no woman here would have you after that. Jesse closed his eyes briefly, and Annie's heart sank because his expression confirmed it was true. Annie, did you propose to her? Annie's voice was steady despite the tears threatening to fall. Did you ask her to marry you? Yes, Jesse said heavily. I did. It was stupid, and I regretted it the moment the words left my mouth. But yes, I asked. Annie felt something crack inside her. When were you planning to tell me? I wasn't, Jesse admitted, because it doesn't matter. It was 2 years ago, Annie. 2 years before I knew you existed. It has nothing to do with us. It has everything to do with us. Annie stood, her voice rising. Don't you see I'm what you settled for, Jesse? I'm the consolation prize you got when Margaret Crawford and my sister both rejected you. I'm not chosen. I'm just convenient. Jesse crossed the distance between them in 3 strides, gripped her shoulders. That is not true. You listen to me, Annie Hartland. Whatever I felt or thought I felt for Margaret Crawford was an illusion. I barely knew her. I proposed because I was lonely and she was beautiful, and I convinced myself that was enough. But it wasn't. She wasn't. And when she said no, it was the best thing that could have happened because it meant I was still available when you walked off that stage in your brown dress and told me the truth. But you wanted her first, Annie said, tears finally spilling over. Just like everyone wanted Evelyn first. I'm always second choice, Jesse. Always. Jesse's face twisted with emotion. You're not hearing me. I didn't want Margaret. I wanted an idea of her that had nothing to do with who she actually was. But you, Annie, I know you. I know you're stubborn and brave, and you work until you drop. I know you sing off key when you think no one's listening, and you talk to the chickens like they're people. I know you bite your lip when you're thinking hard, and you always pour my coffee before your own. I know all of that, and I love all of that, and that's not settling. That's not second choice. That's knowing exactly what I want and being grateful I got it. Annie searched his face, wanting desperately to believe him. She said she's reconsidered, that she wants you now, that she always gets what she wants. Then she's going to be disappointed, Jesse said firmly, because what she wants is a man who doesn't exist anymore. The Jesse who proposed to Margaret Crawford was desperate and lonely and didn't know his own worth. But that man died the day you arrived. The man I am now, I'm yours, Annie. Completely. And nothing Margaret Crawford says or does will change that. She mentioned water access, Annie said quietly. Said you need their creek rights to survive the summer. That they're willing to negotiate if you're amenable to arrangements. Jesse's expression went dark with fury. She said that to you. She threatened our livelihood to manipulate us. He released Annie and paced the kitchen like a caged animal. That's extortion. That's... He stopped, took a breath, turned back to Annie. It doesn't matter. I'll find another way. I'll dig wells, I'll buy water rights from someone else. I'll do whatever it takes. But I will not negotiate with Margaret Crawford, and I will damn sure not let her use our marriage as leverage. But Jesse, the ranch will survive, Jesse said fiercely. Because we're partners, you and I. We're smart, and we work hard, and we'll figure it out together. That's what marriage is, Annie. Not giving up at the first threat, but standing together and fighting for what's ours. Annie felt the doubts loosening their grip, felt the truth of Jesse's words settling into her bones. I'm sorry, she whispered. I let her get in my head. I let her make me doubt us. Jesse pulled her close, tucked her head under his chin. Don't apologize. She's good at finding weak spots and exploiting them. But Annie, you need to trust me when I tell you this. You are not a weak spot. You're my strength. You're the reason I get up in the morning and the reason I can face whatever this country throws at us. And if you ever doubt that again, I'll just have to spend the rest of my life proving it to you. Annie wrapped her arms around her husband and held on tight, breathing in the smell of leather and horses and honest sweat that meant home now. I love you, she said, the words coming easily because they were true. I love you, Jesse Hartland. She felt him go very still. Then his arms tightened around her almost to the point of pain. Say it again, he said roughly. I love you. I love you too, Jessie said against her hair. God help me, Annie. I love you more than I knew it was possible to love anyone. And I will spend every day of my life making sure you never doubt that. They stood like that for a long time, two people holding each other against the weight of threats and doubts, and a world that seemed determined to tear them apart. But they were stronger together than they'd ever been alone, and slowly Annie felt her certainty returning. What are we going to do about the water situation? She asked finally. Jesse pulled back enough to look at her, and Annie saw the determination in his eyes. Tom's been telling me for 2 years to dig wells on the upper property. It's expensive and it's hard work, but it means we won't be dependent on anyone else. We'll start this week, and in the meantime, we'll be careful with what we have. I can help, Annie said. I know you can, Jesse interrupted gently. But tomorrow I need you to do something else. I need you to ride into town with me. We're going to the land office, and we're going to put your name on the deed to this ranch. Equal ownership, legal and binding. Annie's eyes widened. Jesse, you don't have to. Yes, I do, because you're my partner in this, Annie. Not just my wife, not just someone who lives here. My full partner in every way that matters. And if anything ever happens to me, I need to know you'll be protected. That this land will be yours to keep or sell as you see fit. His expression was serious and tense. This is our ranch now, our future, our dream. Say you'll do it. Annie felt tears spilling over again, but these were different tears of gratitude and wonder, and the overwhelming realization that she'd married a man who saw her as an equal when the whole world had always seen her as less than. I'll do it, she said. Yes, Jesse, I'll do it. They rode to Cheyenne the next morning, just the two of them, and at the land office, Jesse signed papers that made Annie a full co-owner of the Heartland Ranch. The clerk raised his eyebrows. Women owning property wasn't unheard of in Wyoming, but it wasn't common either, but Jesse stared him down until he processed the paperwork without comment. Afterward, they walked through town together, and Annie was acutely aware of the looks they drew. The whispers and speculation.
This story was posted on the channel west of Betrayal.
Jesse kept her
Please
hand
do not
firmly in
repost
his,
it
making
in
it
any
clear
form.
to anyone watching that Annie Hartland was his wife, and he was proud of it. They stopped at the general store for supplies, and there Annie came face to face with 3 women clearly cut from the same cloth as Margaret Crawford. Wealthy, fashionable, and looking at Annie like she was something they'd scraped off their boots. Mrs. Hartland, one of them said, her voice dripping false sweetness. How lovely to finally meet you. We've heard so much about your unusual arrival. Mrs. Patterson, Jessie said coolly, stepping closer to Annie. Mrs. Hartland and I were just leaving. Oh, but we simply must get to know her. another woman said, her eyes sharp with malice. After all, it's not every day a man marries someone he's known less than a month. We're all dying of curiosity about what charm she must possess. Annie felt her face flush, but before she could respond, Jesse's voice cut through the tension like a knife. My wife possesses loyalty, intelligence, courage, and the ability to tell truth from poison, which is more than I can say for some. His gray eyes were cold as winter. Now, if you'll excuse us, we have actual work to do. Some of us don't have time to stand around gossiping like school children. He guided Annie out of the store, his hand firm on her back, and didn't speak until they were safely in the wagon heading home. I'm sorry, he said finally. I knew there'd be talk, but I didn't think they'd be so openly cruel. It's fine, Annie said, though it wasn't. I can handle cruel. I've had practice. Jesse pulled the wagon to a stop in the middle of the empty road, turned to face her. You shouldn't have to handle it. You should be welcomed and respected because you're a better woman than any of them will ever be. He took her hand, held it tight. Annie, I know this hasn't been easy. I know coming here meant leaving everything you knew, facing gossip and judgment, and women like Margaret Crawford who want to make you feel small. But you need to know something. You are the best thing that ever happened to me. And anyone who can't see that is a fool. Annie leaned into him, rested her head on his shoulder. Take me home, Jesse. Take me home to our ranch. Our ranch, Jesse repeated like he was tasting the words. I like the sound of that. They drove home through the spring afternoon, past rolling hills covered with new grass and wildflowers, past cattle grazing contentedly past the creek that was already running lower as the season turned toward summer. And when they reached the ranch and saw the house Jesse had built with his own hands, their house now, Annie felt something settle deep in her chest. This was home. Not because of the land or the buildings, but because of the man beside her and the life they were building together. It wouldn't be easy. There would be more Margarets, more droughts, more storms to weather. But they'd face it all together, and that made all the difference. That night, lying in bed with Jesse's arms around her, Annie thought about how far she'd come from that morning in Nebraska when her world had shattered. She'd traveled 1,000 miles, married a stranger, and somehow found exactly what she hadn't known she was looking for, a partner who saw her, chose her, and loved her not despite her plainness, but because of her strength. Jesse, she whispered into the darkness. No regrets. She felt him smile against her hair. Not a single one. You. Annie thought about Evelyn back in Nebraska, about her father's disappointment, about the life she might have had if she'd stayed. None, she said firmly. Not one. Good, Jesse murmured, already half asleep. Because you're stuck with me now, Annie Heartland, for better or worse. For better or worse, Annie agreed and closed her eyes on a day that had started with doubt and ended with certainty. They'd chosen each other, truly chosen, and that was worth more than all the Margaret Crawfords in Wyoming Territory. Summer came to Wyoming Territory with a vengeance, bringing heat that shimmered off the grasslands and a sky so blue it hurt to look at. The creek Jesse had worried about began to run lower each week, just as he'd predicted, and every morning he and the men rode out to check water levels and move cattle to where grazing was still decent. Annie worked alongside them when she could, but more often she found herself managing the homestead, tending the garden that fought against the dry heat, preserving vegetables for the winter ahead, and keeping the household running while the men focused on keeping the herd alive. It was exhausting work, but she'd never been afraid of exhaustion. What she hadn't expected was the loneliness. Elena still came once a week, bringing news from town and companionship that Annie craved more than she wanted to admit. But the rest of the time, Annie was alone from dawn until dusk, with only the chickens and her own thoughts for company. She understood now what Jesse had meant in his letters about the isolation breaking people. The silence out here wasn't peaceful, it was vast and pressing, making her feel simultaneously insignificant and hyper-aware of every small sound. She mentioned it to Jesse one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the valley in shades of copper and gold. "Does it ever get easier?" she asked quietly. The loneliness. Jesse was silent for a long moment, his hand finding hers. "You get used to it, Joe," he said finally. "Or you learn to find company in other things, the land, the work, the animals. But Annie, if you're struggling, if it's too much..." "I'm not leaving," Annie said firmly. "I'm just Adjusting. That's all. Jessie squeezed her hand. The isolation was one of the reasons I needed a wife who could handle it. Most women from back east, they come out here expecting neighbors close by and socials every week. They don't understand that out here you might not see another soul for days or weeks at a time. He paused. But you're stronger than most. You'll adapt. What if I don't want to just adapt? Annie turned to look at him. What if I want to find a way to bring people together out here, make it less lonely for everyone? Jessie's expression was curious. What are you thinking? A gathering? Annie said, the idea forming as she spoke. Once a month, maybe. Invite the neighboring ranches, anyone who wants to come. Nothing fancy, just food and conversation and a chance for people to remember they're not alone out here. That's a lot of work, Jessie said slowly. And not everyone will come. The Crawfords can stay home if they want, Annie interrupted. This isn't about them. It's about building community, making connections. Isn't that what this territory needs? People who'll help each other instead of constantly competing. Jessie looked at her with something like wonder in his eyes. You really are remarkable. You know that most women would be content just surviving out here. You want to build something bigger. I learned from the best, Annie said, leaning into him. You built this ranch from nothing. I'm just trying to build something else, something that might make the hard times a little easier for everyone. Then do it, Jessie said. I'll support you however I can. Just promise me you won't work yourself to death trying to impress people who aren't worth impressing. I promise, Annie said, and kissed him as the last light faded from the sky. The first gathering was planned for the last Sunday in June. Annie sent word through Elena and the men, a simple invitation to anyone who wanted to come for food and fellowship at the Heartland Ranch. She spent the week before cooking and preparing, making enough food to feed an army, even though she had no idea if anyone would show up. Jessie watched her work with a mixture of amusement and concern. Annie, you've made enough biscuits to feed half of Wyoming. What if only 5 people come? Then we'll have biscuits for a month, Annie said, not slowing down. And if 50 people come, we'll just barely have enough. I'd rather have too much than too little. On Sunday morning, Annie woke before dawn with her stomach in knots. She dressed carefully in her second-best dress, pinned her hair up neatly, and tried not to think about all the ways this could go wrong. What if no one came? What if only the Crawfords showed up to mock her? What if people came but hated the food or thought she was presumptuous for even trying? Stop worrying, Jessie said, coming up behind her and wrapping his arms around her waist. Whatever happens, happens. But Annie, you've already succeeded just by trying. That takes courage. By noon, wagons began arriving. First came Tom and Elena with their 3 children, 2 boys and a girl, whom Annie had only met briefly before. Then came a family from the neighboring ranch to the south, the Johnsons, with their teenage daughter and twin sons. Then more families, some Annie recognized from town. Others she'd never seen before. They came in wagons and on horseback, bringing their own dishes to share, and genuine smiles that made Annie's throat tight with relief. By 2 o'clock, there were nearly 40 people scattered across the yard and porch talking and laughing and eating like they'd been starved for exactly this kind of connection. Children ran between the adults playing games Annie remembered from her own childhood. The men gathered near the corral discussing cattle and weather and the best way to dig wells. The women clustered in groups sharing recipes and advice, and the kind of honest conversation that came from people who understood each other's struggles. Annie moved through the crowd, making sure everyone had food, accepting compliments on her cooking with a grace that was growing more natural. She caught Jessie watching her from across the yard, his expression soft with pride.
This story was posted on the channel West of Betrayal. Please do not repost it in any form.
A woman said beside her. Annie turned to find Mrs. Johnson, the neighbor from the south, smiling warmly. This is exactly what this territory needs. We've all been so isolated, so focused on our own survival, that we forgot we're stronger together. That was the idea, Annie said. I just hope people keep coming. They will, Mrs. Johnson said confidently. Mark my words, this will become the event everyone looks forward to. You've given us something precious, community. As the afternoon wore on, Annie noticed a wagon approaching from the east, and her stomach dropped when she recognized the expensive rig and the woman driving it. Margaret Crawford had come after all, and she wasn't alone. Her father and brother flanked her, and behind them came 2 more wagons full of people Annie didn't recognize. The conversation died down as the Crawfords arrived, tension crackling through the air like heat lightning. Jesse immediately moved to Annie's side, his hand finding the small of her back in a gesture of support and warning. Margaret dismounted with practiced grace, her dress far too fine for a casual ranch gathering, her smile sharp as broken glass. "Annie," she called out sweetly, "what a charming little party. We simply couldn't resist the invitation." "You're welcome here," Annie said, her voice steady, despite her racing heart. "There's plenty of food. Help yourselves." Samuel Crawford surveyed the gathering with calculating eyes, clearly assessing who had come and what alliances might be forming. "Quite the turnout, Jesse. Your wife seems to have a talent for gathering folks together." "She does," Jesse said flatly. "Annie's good at bringing out the best in people. Some of us appreciate that quality." The barb landed, and Samuel's expression hardened slightly. But before he could respond, Margaret stepped forward, addressing the crowd with the confidence of someone used to commanding attention. "I think it's wonderful that Annie's trying to build community," she announced, her voice carrying across the yard. "After all, she's so new to Wyoming, she probably doesn't understand all the complicated relationships and histories here. The territories that have been in dispute for years, the water rights that have caused so much tension, the old grievances that don't just disappear because someone serves biscuits." The crowd shifted uncomfortably. Annie felt Jesse tense beside her, but she squeezed his hand gently, a signal to let her handle this. "You're right, Mrs. Crawford," Annie said clearly. "I am new here, and because I'm new, I don't have any investment in old grievances. I just see neighbors who could help each other instead of fighting each other. I see families who are struggling with the same challenges and could share solutions. And I see a territory that will only thrive if we work together instead of tearing each other apart." She paused, meeting Margaret's eyes directly. "You're welcome to hold on to whatever disputes you want. That's your choice. But you're also welcome to lay them down and join us in building something better. The invitation stands for you and for anyone else who wants to move forward instead of staying stuck in the past." For a moment, silence hung heavy in the air. Then Mrs. Johnson began to clap slowly at first, then louder. Others joined in, and soon the applause rippled through the gathering. Margaret's face flushed with anger, but she was trapped by her own games. She couldn't storm off without looking petty, and she couldn't stay without tacitly accepting Annie's olive branch. Samuel Crawford made the decision for her, guiding her firmly toward the food tables with a hand on her elbow and a warning look. "Let's eat," he said gruffly. "No point in wasting a trip." The tension broke and conversation resumed, though Annie noticed people were careful to keep the Crawfords at a comfortable distance. Jesse pulled Annie aside, his eyes shining with admiration. "That was perfect," he said quietly. "You disarmed her completely, made her look small without being cruel about it." "I meant what I said," Annie replied. "The invitation really does stand, even for her, especially for her maybe. Because holding on to hate and grudges out here, it'll kill you faster than any drought." Jesse cupped her face in his hands and kissed her softly. "Have I mentioned lately that marrying you was the smartest thing I ever did?" "You might have mentioned it once or twice," Annie said with a smile, "but I don't mind hearing it again." As the sun began its descent toward the mountains, families started packing up to leave, thanking Annie profusely and promising to come to the next gathering. The Crawfords left early, Margaret's departure marked by tight smiles and thinly veiled promises that this wasn't over. But Annie refused to let it dim her happiness. She'd done what she set out to do, created a space where people could come together, and she'd shown that community was possible, even in this hard country. After the last wagon rolled away and the yard was cleaned up, Annie and Jesse sat on the porch steps watching the stars emerge. Annie was exhausted, but glowing with the kind of satisfaction that came from work that mattered. "So," Jesse said, pulling her close, "monthly gatherings. If people keep coming, yes. Maybe every 6 weeks in winter when the weather's bad and travel is harder." Jesse nodded slowly. "You know what you've done, don't you? You've made this ranch a center point, a place people will think of when they need help, or community, or just a reminder that they're not alone. That's powerful, Annie. That's the kind of thing that changes a territory." "I just wanted to make things a little less lonely," Annie said. "For everyone." "Well, you succeeded." Jesse kissed her temple. "And you've given me something I didn't even know I needed: pride. I'm so damn proud of you, Annie, of who you are and what you're building here. They sat in comfortable silence, and Annie thought about how much had changed in just a few months. She'd arrived in Wyoming as nobody's first choice, a substitute bride with no prospects and no expectations. And now she was building community, standing up to women like Margaret Crawford and partnering with a man who saw her as an equal. But the peace didn't last long. 3 days after the gathering, Jesse came home from town with news that made Annie's blood run cold. "The Crawfords have filed a water rights claim with the territorial government," he said, his face grim. "They're claiming that the creek running through our property actually originates on their land, which gives them primary rights. If they win, they can restrict our water access, limit how much we can draw when we can draw it. Could kill half our herd by summer's end." Annie felt her stomach drop. Can they do that legally? If they can prove the claim, yes. And Samuel Crawford has money for lawyers and surveyors and all the documentation he needs. Jesse paced the kitchen like a caged animal. "This is retaliation, Annie, for the gathering, for making Margaret look foolish, for not giving in to their pressure. They're going to strangle us financially because I chose you over her." "Then we fight back," Annie said firmly. "We hire our own surveyor, we document our water usage, we prove that creek has been feeding this ranch since before the Crawfords even owned their land." "That takes money we don't have," Jesse said heavily. "Money I was planning to spend on those wells. If I hire lawyers and surveyors, we won't have enough left to finish the wells before winter. And if we don't finish the wells, we're completely dependent on the creek, which is exactly where the Crawfords want us." Annie's mind raced, trying to find a solution. Then something Elena had mentioned weeks ago came back to her. "What about the territorial representative, the one who's supposed to mediate disputes?" Jesse shook his head. "Samuel Crawford contributes heavily to his campaigns. He's not going to rule against the Crawfords." "But what if the community supports us? What if everyone who came to the gathering stands with us? Safety in numbers, right? It's harder to rule against one rancher, but what about 20 families all saying the Crawfords are trying to monopolize water rights?" Jesse stopped pacing, looked at her with dawning hope. "That might actually work. If we can show it's not just our problem, but a threat to every small rancher in the area. If we can make it about fairness and community instead of just one land dispute." "Then that's what we do," Annie said. "We talk to everyone who came to the gathering. We explain what's happening. We ask them to stand with us, not because we're special, but because if the Crawfords can do this to us, they can do it to anyone." Over the next week, Jesse and Annie rode to every ranch within 20 miles, telling their story and asking for support. Some agreed immediately, seeing the threat for what it was. Others were hesitant, afraid of angering the powerful Crawfords. But slowly, steadily, Annie and Jesse built a coalition of neighbors willing to stand together against what they saw as an abuse of power. The territorial representative, a politician named William Hayworth, agreed to hear the dispute at a public meeting in Cheyenne. The day of the meeting, Annie dressed in her best dress and braided her hair into a crown, trying to look respectable and confident, even though her stomach was churning with fear. The meeting hall was packed. The Crawfords sat in the front row with their expensive lawyers looking confident and powerful. Behind Annie and Jesse sat nearly 30 people from neighboring ranches, a visible show of community support that made Hayworth's eyebrows rise with interest. Samuel Crawford presented his case first with surveys and documents and legal arguments that made Annie's head spin. He painted Jesse as a newcomer trying to steal water that rightfully belonged to the Crawford family legacy. He suggested that Jesse had married in haste and was now trying to expand beyond what his ranch could sustainably support. Then it was Jesse's turn. He stood, cleared his throat, and spoke with the plain honesty that was his nature. "Mr. Hayworth,
this story was posted on the channel west of Betrayal. Please do not repost it in any
my
form.
Household since before the Crawfords bought the adjacent property. I've never restricted anyone's access to water, never claimed more than I needed. This dispute isn't about water, it's about power. It's about one wealthy family trying to control resources so they can force smaller ranchers out of business and buy up our land cheap." He gestured to the people behind him. "These folks are here because they see what's really happening. Today it's my ranch. Tomorrow it could be theirs. And if we let the Crawfords get away with this, we're saying that money and power matter more than fairness and community. I don't believe that's the kind of territory we want to build." Hayworth looked thoughtful, but Annie could see the calculation in his eyes. He was weighing political donations against public opinion, trying to figure out which way to rule without damaging his own interests. That's when Annie stood up. "Mr. Hayworth, she said clearly, her voice carrying through the crowded hall. "May I speak?" Jesse looked surprised, but Hayworth nodded. "Mrs. Hartland, go ahead." Annie stepped into the aisle, very aware of Margaret Crawford's eyes boring into her back. "I came to Wyoming Territory 3 months ago as a bride for a man I'd never met. I had nothing, no money, no prospects, no connections, just a willingness to work hard and deal honestly with people." She paused, gathering her courage. "Since I arrived, I've learned something about this territory. There are 2 kinds of people here, those who build up and those who tear down. Those who see neighbors as allies and those who see them as competition. The Crawfords could have welcomed us, could have worked with us to manage water resources fairly. Instead, they've tried to use their wealth and power to destroy us." Annie turned to look directly at Margaret, who was staring at her with undisguised hatred. "Mrs. Crawford told me once that she always gets what she wants. But this isn't about what one person wants. It's about what's fair, what's right, what kind of community we're going to be." She turned back to Hayworth. "Mr. Jesse Hartland built his ranch with his own hands. He's helped neighbors when they needed it, never asked for more than his fair share, and treated everyone with respect. He deserves the same treatment in return. We all do. And I'm asking you to rule based on fairness, not based on who has the most money or the most influence. Because if you don't, you're telling everyone here that justice is only for the wealthy. Is that really the message you want to send?" The hall was silent when Annie finished. She could feel her hands shaking, feel the weight of everyone's eyes on her, but she'd said what needed saying and she refused to regret it. Hayworth was quiet for a long moment, studying Annie with newfound respect. Then he cleared his throat. "I'll need a week to review all the evidence and make my determination," he said. "But I want to say this Mrs. Hartland makes a good point. This territory was built by people willing to work hard and deal fairly with each other. We succeed when we work together and we fail when we tear each other apart. I'll take that into consideration when I make my ruling." The meeting adjourned, and as people filed out, several neighbors stopped to shake Annie's hand or pat her shoulder in support. Jesse pulled her aside, his eyes shining with pride. "That was incredible," he said softly. "You were incredible." "I just told the truth," Annie said, though she was trembling now that the adrenaline was fading. "You did more than that. You stood up to power with nothing but your courage and your words, and you made them listen." Jesse kissed her forehead. "Win or lose, Annie, I'm so damn proud to be your husband." They were halfway to the door when Margaret Crawford stepped into their path. Her beautiful face was twisted with fury, all pretense of civility abandoned. "You think you've won," she hissed at Annie. "You think your little speech changed anything. But I know men like William Hayworth. Money talks louder than sentiment, and when this is over, when you've lost your ranch and your husband and everything you thought you'd built, I'll be waiting, because I always get what I want, Annie. Always." Annie met Margaret's eyes steadily, refusing to flinch. "Then I feel sorry for you," she said quietly. "Because the thing you want most, my husband, is the one thing you'll never have. Not because he couldn't have you, but because he doesn't want you. He never did. And no amount of money or manipulation will change that." She took Jesse's hand and walked past Margaret without looking back, leaving the other woman sputtering with impotent rage. The week of waiting was agony. Jesse tried to focus on ranch work, but Annie could see the tension in every line of his body. She kept busy with the household and the garden, but her mind was constantly circling back to the dispute, imagining all the ways it could go wrong. On the 7th day, a rider came from town with a letter bearing the territorial seal. Jesse opened it with shaking hands while Annie stood beside him, her heart in her throat. He read in silence, his expression unreadable. Then he looked up at Annie and she saw tears in his eyes. "We won," he said hoarsely. "Hayworth ruled in our favor. Said the creek is shared water that the Crawfords can't restrict our access. He even fined them for filing what he called a frivolous claim intended to harass a neighboring landowner." Annie's legs went weak with relief. She grabbed Jesse's arms to steady herself, and suddenly they were both laughing and crying at once, holding each other like they'd just survived a battle. which Annie supposed they had. We won. She repeated the words, tasting like victory and vindication and justice all mixed together. You won, Jessie corrected, pulling back to look at her. Your speech, your courage, that's what made the difference. Hayworth would have ruled for the Crawfords if you hadn't spoken up. You saved us, Annie. We saved each other, Annie said firmly. That's what partners do. News of the ruling spread quickly through the territory. The next Sunday's gathering was even bigger than the first, with people coming from as far as 50 miles away to celebrate the victory and to meet the woman who'd stood up to the Crawfords. Annie found herself the center of attention in a way that would have terrified her months ago, but now she handled it with grace and humor, deflecting praise and redirecting conversation to the community they were building together. Margaret Crawford didn't attend, and Annie heard through Elena that the family had become somewhat isolated after the ruling, their tactics exposed and their reputation damaged. Part of Annie felt sorry for them. Not Margaret, who'd earned her humiliation, but her father and brother who were caught in the fallout. But mostly she felt relieved that the threat had passed, and they could focus on building their life instead of defending it. As summer turned to autumn and the first cold winds began to blow down from the mountains, Annie stood on the porch one evening watching the sunset and taking stock of her life. She was 6 months married to a man she loved more deeply than she'd thought possible. She was co-owner of a thriving ranch, respected by her neighbors, and at the center of a growing community that she'd helped create. She had purpose and partnership and the kind of bone-deep satisfaction that came from work that mattered. Jesse came up behind her, wrapped his arms around her waist, and rested his chin on her shoulder. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "About how I got here," Annie said softly. "About Evelyn refusing to come, about Papa sending me in her place, about thinking I was nobody's first choice. And now," Annie turned in his arms, looked up at her husband's weathered face. "Now I know I was always meant to be here. Not as a substitute or second choice, but as exactly who you needed and who I needed to become. Evelyn couldn't have done this, Jesse. She couldn't have stood beside you through storms and disputes and all the hard work of building something real. This life chose me as much as I chose it." Jesse's smile was soft and full of love. "You were never second choice, Annie. You were destiny. I just didn't know it until you stepped off that stage and told me the truth. And every day since you've proven it over and over." "I love you," Annie said simply because it was the truest thing she knew. "I love you too," Jesse replied, and kissed her as the sun set over their valley, painting everything in shades of gold and promise. They stood like that for a long time, two people who'd found each other against all odds and built something beautiful from nothing but determination and hope. The work would never be done. There would always be more storms to weather, more challenges to face, more growing to do, but they'd face it together as partners and equals, and that made all the difference. As darkness fell and the first stars appeared, Annie heard the distant sound of wolves howling on the ridge. Once that sound would have frightened her. Now it was just part of the landscape, part of the wild beauty of Wyoming territory that she'd learned to love. Jesse heard it too, and his arms tightened around her protectively. "Should we go inside?" "Not yet," Annie said, leaning into his warmth. "Let's stay out here a little longer, under our sky, on our land, in our life." "Our life," Jesse repeated, and Annie could hear the wonder in his voice, like he still couldn't quite believe his good fortune. They'd started this journey as strangers bound by obligation and desperation. But somewhere along the way, through honest work and honest words, through storms, weathered, and battles won. Through the slow daily revelation of each other's hearts, they'd become something more. Not just husband and wife, but true partners. Not just surviving, but thriving. Annie Hartland, who'd once been nobody's first choice, had become her own first choice. And in doing so, she'd claimed a life richer and fuller than anything her sister's
This story was posted on the channel west of Betrayal.
She was exactly where she was meant to be, in any form. Exactly who she was meant to be with. And that Annie thought as Jesse led her inside to the warmth and light of their home was the truest kind of happy ending, not perfect, not easy, but real and earned and worth every difficult step it took to get there. The Wyoming wind sang through the eaves that night, and in the morning, Annie and Jesse would wake to face whatever challenges the day brought. But they'd face them together, and that made them strong enough to weather anything this hard country could throw at them. Their story had begun with a sister's betrayal and a desperate substitution. But it had become something neither of them expected, a love story built on truth, tested by hardship, and proven true by the choosing they did every single day. Not second choice, not destiny's accident, but the right choice made deliberately again and again and again. And in the end, that was all that mattered.